Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Minnesota winter doesn't forgive mistakes. I learned that the hard way 3 years ago, though I'm still not sure what exactly I learned, or if learning is even the right word for what happened to me that night in February. I'd been at my brother's bachelor party. Nothing fancy, just 8 guys at a dive bar outside Duluth, the kind of place where the floor sticks to your boots and nobody asks questions. The celebration had gotten away from me. 1 shot became 5, 5 became 10, and somewhere after midnight, I decided I could walk back to my motel. It was only 2 miles, I told myself, stumbling out into the parking lot while the others were still arguing over darts. The cold hit like a physical thing, sharp enough to cut through the whiskey haze for a moment. -20, maybe colder. The kind of cold that makes your lungs ache and turns your breath into crystals that fall straight down. I should have turned back right then, but drunk logic is its own special kind of stupidity. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking. The road stretched out black between walls of plowed snow. No streetlights. Just the occasional security lamp from a closed business casting long shadows across the ice. My phone was dead. I'd been using it all night to show videos, drain the battery on stupid things that seemed important when you're drunk. The wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across the asphalt, and within minutes I couldn't feel my face. That's when I made the mistake that should have killed me. I saw what looked like a shortcut through the trees, a path that would cut straight toward the motel instead of following the road's long curve. My frozen brain convinced me it made perfect sense. I climbed over the snowbank and started walking into the woods. The trees closed in immediately, darker than the road, darker than anything I'd experienced. The snow was deeper here, unplowed, coming up past my knees. Each step became a struggle, and the cold, God, the cold was something alive, something with teeth. It bit through my jacket, through my jeans, found every gap in my clothing and poured in like water. I don't know how long I walked. Time does strange things when you're freezing. Minutes feel like hours. Hours collapse into seconds. The trees all look the same, black verticals against slightly less black sky. I tried to retrace my steps, but the falling snow had already filled them in. My hands were numb clubs at the ends of my arms. My feet might as well have not existed. Then I fell. Not a dramatic tumble, just my legs giving out, dropping me face first into the snow. I tried to push myself up, but my arms wouldn't work right. The snow was soft, almost warm compared to the air. Some distant part of my brain knew this was hypothermia talking, the dangerous moment when freezing to death starts to feel comfortable, but I couldn't make myself care. I turned my head to breathe and lay there, watching the snow fall through the gap in the trees above. That's when I heard it. "Wake up!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, loud enough to shake snow from the branches, clear as breaking glass. Not a human voice exactly. It had too many layers, like a chord played on an organ, reverberating through my chest. I jerked upright, suddenly completely alert, adrenaline flooding my system. The forest was silent except for the wind. I looked around wildly, but saw nothing, no one, just trees and snow and darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The word disappeared into the woods without an echo. But now I was on my feet, and more importantly, I was afraid. Not drunk afraid or cold afraid, but primitively, fundamentally terrified. Something was watching me. I could feel it the way you feel someone staring at the back of your head, that crawling sensation between your shoulder blades. But this was everywhere, pressing in from all sides. I started moving, no longer walking but running, or trying to run, high-stepping through the deep snow. Branches whipped at my face, caught my jacket, tried to hold me back. Behind me, or was it beside me? I heard something moving through the trees, keeping pace. Not footsteps exactly, more like a sliding, a shifting of weight that made the snow whisper. The voice came again, not shouting this time, but speaking directly into my ear, intimate as a lover. "This way." I shouldn't have listened. Every rational part of me screamed not to trust it. But I turned anyway, stumbling in the direction the voice seemed to indicate. The presence followed, always just outside my vision, a darkness darker than the night, a shape that wouldn't quite resolve when I turned to look. More words came, not in English. I'm not sure they were words at all, more like meanings that appeared in my head. Move. Now. Faster. Don't stop. The trees began to thin. I could see lights ahead, the blessed, beautiful lights of the motel parking lot. I ran harder, crashed through the last of the undergrowth, and fell onto plowed asphalt. When I looked back, the forest was still and silent. Nothing followed me out. I made it to my room somehow, cranked the heat, and sat in a scalding shower until feeling returned to my extremities in waves of agony. I should have had frostbite, should have lost fingers, toes, should have died. The next morning, apart from a brutal hangover, I was fine, completely fine. I tried to find the path I'd taken when I went back in daylight. There was no trail through those woods, no opening in the trees where I'd entered. The bartender at the dive, when I asked him about it later, said those woods were impassable in winter, full of ravines and frozen streams. Said a local woman had died out there just the month before, wandered off drunk and froze to death not 50 yards from the road. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. I've never been alone since then. Not truly alone. There's always something just outside my peripheral vision, a density in the air that wasn't there before. Sometimes lying in bed, I hear breathing that isn't mine, feel the mattress depress slightly as if something is sitting on the edge. Not threatening exactly. Watching. Waiting. I looked up hypothermia hallucinations, of course. The voice, the presence. Textbook symptoms of a brain shutting down from cold. The mind creates companionship in its final moments, guardian angels, deceased relatives, whatever it needs to not die alone. That's the rational explanation. But hypothermia hallucinations end when you warm up. They don't follow you home. They don't sit in your apartment at 3 a.m., making the air thick and electric. They don't whisper words in languages that were never meant for human throats, words that bypass your ears and appear directly in your understanding. Last week, my nephew went missing for 6 hours during a snowstorm. They found him in a playground, building a snowman, completely fine despite wearing only a light jacket. When they asked him how he stayed warm, he said the dark man helped him, told him where to go, kept him moving. My sister thinks it was his imagination. The search and rescue team called it a miracle. But when my nephew described the voice he heard, layers upon layers like an organ chord, my blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with winter. I want to warn him. Want to tell him that whatever saved us demands payment, even if I don't know what currency it accepts. But what would I say? That something lives in the Minnesota cold. Something that chooses who lives and who dies according to rules we can't understand. That being saved is sometimes worse than dying, because now you know there are things watching from the spaces between snowflakes, things that can reach into our world when the temperature drops low enough. The forecast says another blizzard is coming. The worst in a decade, they're calling it. I should leave town, drive south until I hit someplace warm. But I know I won't. I'll stay here, in my apartment with its shadows that move wrong, with its corners that hold too much darkness. Because part of me, the part that turned when the voice said this way, the part that obeyed without thinking, is waiting. Waiting to hear that voice again. Waiting to find out what it really wants. Waiting to learn if being saved was really salvation, or just a postponement of something worse. The wind is picking up outside. Through my window I can see snow starting to fall, each flake catching the streetlight before disappearing into darkness. Somewhere out there, in the space between the trees, something is moving. Something is watching. Something is choosing. And God help me, I think it's coming closer. Story 2. Pines at Palmetto Island Camping Resort. Whisper things that shouldn't be whispered. I know this now, though I wish I didn't. It started 3 nights ago when I took a wrong turn on the trail. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in patches of golden shadow, creating patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours, following what I thought was the marked path back to my campsite, but the familiar landmarks had dissolved into an endless maze of identical trees. The first sign something was wrong came as a smell, sweet rot mixed with diesel exhaust, hanging in the air where no vehicles should be. The forest path was too narrow for cars, too remote for machinery, yet the stench clung to my nostrils, growing stronger with each step forward. My phone showed no signal, the GPS spinning uselessly as if the satellites themselves had forgotten this patch of Earth existed. The compass app pointed north, then east, then nowhere at all, the needle dancing in circles like something beneath the ground was pulling at it. That's when I heard the engine. It rumbled low and steady, somewhere beyond the wall of pines to my left. The sound didn't belong here, couldn't belong here, yet it persisted. An old diesel engine, badly maintained, coughing black smoke I could taste but couldn't see. I pushed through the undergrowth toward it, thorns catching at my clothes, leaving thin scratches that burned more than they should. The trees opened onto a dirt road I'd never seen before. Not on any map, not on any trail guide. Just a narrow strip of packed earth cutting through the forest like a wound. And there, idling at the edge where shadow met fading sunlight, sat a pickup truck that looked older than the resort itself. The paint had long ago surrendered to rust, leaving patches of oxidized metal that resembled diseased skin. The windshield was tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but I felt eyes watching me through that black glass, waiting. The driver's door opened with a shriek of protesting metal. The man who emerged moved wrong, too fluid in some places, too rigid in others, as if his joints bent in directions mine didn't. He wore clothes that might have been blue once but had faded to the color of deep water at night. His face remained shadowed beneath a cap pulled low, but his smile stretched wider than physics should allow. He said I looked lost, said it without moving his lips quite right, the words arriving a fraction of a second before or after they should. Said he knew the way back to the main camp, that he'd be happy to give me a ride. Every instinct screamed against getting in that truck. The smell of decay grew stronger near it, and underneath the diesel fumes was something else, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat. But the sun was setting fast, painting the forest in shades of blood and shadow, and I could hear things beginning to move in the undergrowth, things that walked on too many legs, or perhaps not enough. I climbed into the passenger seat. The interior was wrong. The space inside seemed larger than the truck's exterior should allow, the dashboard stretching away into shadows my eyes couldn't quite penetrate. The seats were cracked leather that felt warm and damp, pulsing slightly as if something beneath was breathing. The rearview mirror reflected nothing. Not the road behind us, not the forest, not even my own face. Just a gray void that hurt to look at directly. The man's hands on the steering wheel weren't quite hands. The fingers were too long, with too many joints, and his nails were thick and yellowed like old bone. He turned the key and the engine sound changed. No longer mechanical, but organic. A wet churning like a massive heart pumping black blood through metal veins. We drove, but the road beneath us didn't match the movement I felt. We seemed to glide sideways as often as forward, the trees outside the windows bending in impossible directions. The speedometer needle spun wildly, showing speeds that should have sent us careening into the forest, yet we crawled along at what felt like walking pace. He told me about the resort, speaking in that not quite synchronized way, how it was built on old ground, sacred ground that remembered things from before humans drew maps and built roads. How sometimes the forest took people who wandered too far from the marked paths. How it kept them, changed them, sent them back different. The entrance to the camping resort appeared ahead, the familiar wooden sign with its cheerful painted lettering. But he didn't slow down. The truck accelerated past it, the sign blurring into abstract shapes and colors. I reached for the door handle, but my fingers found only smooth metal where it should have been. He said we were almost there. Said it with that too wide smile stretching even further, revealing teeth that weren't quite teeth. Too many, too sharp, arranged in patterns that made my eyes water to count. The forest outside grew darker, denser, older. Trees that couldn't exist in this climate pressed against the windows, their bark covered in symbols that squirmed and rearranged themselves when I tried to read them. The truck's interior began to change. The cracked leather seats sprouted what looked like hair or thin roots, wrapping around my arms and legs with gentle insistence. The dashboard melted and reformed, showing gauges that measured things I didn't have words for. The radio turned on by itself, broadcasting static that almost sounded like screaming if I listened too carefully. Then, suddenly, we stopped. But we weren't at any campsite I recognized. We were in a clearing where the trees grew in perfect concentric circles, their trunks twisted into spiral patterns that hurt to follow with my eyes. The ground was covered in grass that moved without wind, reaching upward like desperate fingers. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that might have been a cabin once, or might have been trying to become one, its walls shifting between wood and something organic, windows that opened onto rooms that couldn't fit inside its dimensions. The man turned to look at me fully for the first time, and I saw his face clearly. It was my face. Older, changed, wrong in every detail, but unmistakably mine. He spoke with my voice, told me I'd been here before, would be here again. That time moved differently in the spaces between the marked paths, that past and future were just directions like north and south, and we could drive to either if we knew the roads. I ran. Somehow the door was open, or maybe it had never been closed, or maybe there had never been a door at all. I ran through the circular clearing, past the trees that whispered my name in voices I almost recognized. The grass grabbed at my ankles, trying to root me to the spot, but I tore free and plunged into the forest. Behind me the engine started again, that wet, organic sound echoing through the trees, getting closer no matter which direction I ran. The headlights cast shadows that fell upward, illuminating the canopy while leaving the ground in darkness. I could hear him laughing with my voice, promising we'd meet again on a different road, in a different time, when I was ready to understand. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing beside a familiar trail marker. The main camp was just visible through the trees, normal people moving around normal tents, preparing normal dinners over normal fires. The sun was still up, barely, as if only minutes had passed since I'd first gotten lost, not the hours I'd experienced. But when I looked at my phone, the date was wrong. 3 days wrong. 3 days I couldn't remember, or 3 days that hadn't happened yet, or 3 days that existed sideways to the ones everyone else had lived. The scratches on my arms from the thorns formed patterns, symbols that matched the ones on those impossible trees, that rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. They still burn, especially at night, especially when I hear engines in the distance. I've tried to leave the resort 5 times now. Each time I find myself back at my campsite with no memory of returning. The other campers don't see me anymore, or they see through me, or maybe I'm seeing through them to some other time when they camped here, or will camp here, or are camping here in a direction I can't quite perceive. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the truck through the trees. Different colors, different states of decay, but always with that darkness where the driver should be visible. Sometimes it's following other hikers who've wandered off the marked paths. Sometimes the driver waves at me with hands that might be mine. The resort's manager told me yesterday, or tomorrow, it's hard to keep track, that they've had complaints about an abandoned truck blocking one of the old service roads. Been there for years, he said. Decades, maybe. Previous owner disappeared on a hike back in the 80s. They keep meaning to have it towed, but somehow never get around to it. Something about it makes people uncomfortable, he said. Something about the way it seems to watch you. He showed me a photo from the resort's historical archive. The truck in the picture was the same one, but newer, cleaner. And standing beside it, smiling at the camera, was a man who looked exactly like me. Exactly like the driver. The photo was dated 37 years before I was born. I've stopped trying to leave. The pines whisper more clearly now, and I'm beginning to understand their language. They speak of roads that run through time instead of space, of drivers who ferry passengers between moments that never quite were and always are. They speak of the price of taking wrong turns in places where the earth remembers older maps. Sometimes when lost hikers pass my campsite, they ask for directions. I tell them to stick to the marked paths, to ignore any engines they might hear in the forest, to never ever accept rides from strangers, no matter how lost they feel. Most of them listen, some don't. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find myself behind the wheel of a truck I don't remember entering, driving roads that shouldn't exist, offering rides to faces that look familiar in ways that make my teeth ache. The engine runs on something thicker than diesel, and the radio plays static that almost sounds like screaming. And in the rearview mirror that reflects nothing, I can almost see the shape of what I'm becoming, or have already become, or will become, when the roads finally lead me back to myself. The pines at Palmetto Island whisper things that shouldn't be whispered. They whisper about the driver who was, and is, and will be. They whisper about the passengers who step out of his truck different than they entered, if they step out at all. They whisper about me. And now, if you listen carefully to the sound of engines in places where no vehicles should be, they whisper about you too. Because you've read this. Because you know about the roads between the marked paths. Because somewhere, somewhen, there's a truck waiting for you, driven by someone who might be you, might have been you, might become you when you finally take that wrong turn you're destined to take. The scratches on my arms have started to spell out words. Tomorrow's words. Yesterday's words. Words from directions that don't have names. They burn with the truth of things that exist in the spaces between seconds, in the places between places. And tonight, when the moon is dark and the pines whisper loudest, I can feel the keys in my pocket. Keys I've never owned to a truck I've never driven, waiting for me to understand that I've always been the driver. I've always been the passenger. I've always been the road itself, winding through time in directions that make compasses spin and GPS systems fail, leading travelers to destinations they've already reached and futures they haven't lived yet. The resort manager knocked on my tent this morning, or last year, or never. He said there have been complaints about someone offering rides to hikers, someone who drives an old truck that shouldn't be able to access the forest paths. He said if I see anything suspicious, I should report it immediately. I promised him I would. Then I went to check on the truck that's been waiting for me all along, in the place where the road remembers itself differently. The engine started before I turned the key, purring with anticipation of journeys already taken, yet to come, happening now in sideways time. There are new scratches on the dashboard, tallies maybe, or a countdown, or a count up to something that's already happened and is waiting to happen again. The pines know, they've always known, and now, so do I, so do you. See you on the road, or maybe I already have, or maybe I will. When you take that wrong turn that's been waiting for you since before the resort was built on ground, that remembers older maps, older roads, older drivers who ferry passengers between the moments that fall through the cracks of ordinary time. The engine is running. It's always been running. And somewhere, somewhen, you're already in the passenger seat, wondering why the driver's smile seems so familiar, why it seems so much like your own. Story 3. The first time I saw the shadow, I convinced myself it was exhaustion. 3 weeks into our residence at the terrace house on Elm Row, the weight of single parenthood had settled into my bones like dampness seeping through old walls. The shadow rushed past my peripheral vision as I stood in the narrow hallway, a darkness deeper than the already dim corridor should have allowed. When I turned, nothing remained but the familiar stretch of faded wallpaper and the persistent smell of mothballs that no amount of airing seemed to dispel. The house had been a necessity, not a choice. After the separation, my budget dictated our options, and the 1900s terrace home with its peeling paint and groaning floorboards represented the best I could manage. The landlord, an elderly woman with clouded eyes, had handed over the keys with trembling fingers, muttering something about the house having particular ways. I'd dismissed it as the ramblings of age, more concerned with the reasonable rent than cryptic warnings. That rushing shadow marked the beginning of my unraveling. though I didn't recognize it then. The house possessed an oppressive quality that pressed against my chest each time I crossed the threshold. The air hung thick and stale despite open windows, and sounds traveled strangely through the walls, sometimes muffled, sometimes amplified beyond reason. The neighbor's television became a distant murmur, while my own footsteps echoed like thunderclaps. The door slam started during the second month. Not the casual closing of doors caught by drafts, but violent, purposeful impacts that shook picture frames and sent vibrations through the floorboards. The first occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I jolted awake, heart hammering, certain someone had broken in. I crept through each room, checking locks, peering into shadows, finding nothing disturbed except my peace of mind. The front door remained bolted, the back door secured, yet the sound had been undeniable. A forceful slam from somewhere within the house's bowels. Sleep became elusive after that night. I'd lie awake, muscles tensed, waiting for the next disturbance. Sometimes it came as footsteps overhead, heavy and deliberate, pacing the length of the attic I'd never accessed. The landlord claimed she'd lost the key years ago, that the space held nothing but insulation and memories. Yet those footsteps suggested otherwise, suggested presence, intention, restlessness. During daylight hours, I could almost convince myself of reasonable explanations. Old houses settle, pipes expand and contract. The terrace structure meant sounds from adjoining homes traveled in unexpected ways, but rationalization crumbled each night when darkness transformed familiar spaces into alien territory. Doorways became portals to uncertainty. Shadows gained substance and intent. The voices started subtly, whispers that might have been wind through gaps in the window frames, murmurs that could have been water moving through ancient pipes. But gradually, they gained clarity and proximity, not words exactly, but the cadence and rhythm of conversation, urgent, insistent, growing louder when I tried to sleep. I'd press pillows against my ears, hum to myself, anything to drown out those impossible sounds emanating from empty rooms. My work suffered. Colleagues noticed the dark circles, the tremor in my hands, the way I'd drift mid-conversation. Attention pulled toward sounds only I seemed to hear. They suggested stress, recommended therapists, offered concerned smiles that never reached their eyes. I couldn't explain that the exhaustion stemmed not from divorce or single parenthood, but from nightly vigilance against intruders that might not exist. I installed cameras, cheap ones from an online retailer. The footage revealed nothing but empty rooms and my own increasingly erratic behavior. I'd watch myself on the playback, see my head snap toward corners where nothing stirred, observe my lips moving in response to unheard provocations. The disconnect between my experience and the recorded evidence created a schism in my perception of reality. The house seemed to sense my growing instability and responded with escalating phenomena. Doors didn't just slam now. They opened and closed in sequence, creating rhythms that felt like communication. The shadow no longer rushed past but lingered at the edges of vision, a darkness that possessed weight and watching intelligence. The footsteps descended from the attic, traveled the hallway, paused outside my bedroom door. I stopped inviting people over. The house felt hostile to visitors, the atmosphere thickening when others entered, as if resenting the intrusion. A friend who stopped by unannounced left within minutes, claiming sudden nausea. The repair technician I'd called about the perpetually dripping kitchen faucet worked in visible discomfort, constantly glancing over his shoulder, finishing hastily and refusing payment just to leave sooner. Research into the house's history yielded fragments but no clarity. Previous tenants rarely lasted more than 6 months. The original builders had constructed the terrace row in 1906, but records grew spotty after a fire in 1923 that damaged but didn't destroy the structure. News archives mentioned occasional police calls to the address, domestic disturbances where officers found only single occupants, break-in reports with no signs of forced entry, noise complaints from neighbors about vacant units. The breaking point approached gradually, then arrived all at once. I'd grown accustomed to the nightly disturbances, had developed coping mechanisms, white noise machines, sleeping pills, a rigid routine that provided an illusion of control. But the house had been building toward something, and I'd been too exhausted to recognize the escalation's trajectory. The final week brought new phenomena. Objects moved, subtle shifts that might have been memory lapses except for their consistency. Coffee mugs migrated from kitchen to living room. Books rearranged themselves on shelves. My keys appeared in places I'd never leave them, inside the refrigerator, beneath sofa cushions, hanging from doorknobs I hadn't touched. Cold spots developed throughout the house, pockets of Arctic air that raised goosebumps and visible breath even in summer heat. They moved like living things, following me from room to room, clustering around my bed at night. The smell changed too. Mothballs gave way to something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The shadow gained definition, no longer a peripheral flicker, but a distinct form that moved with purpose through the house. I'd catch it ascending stairs, disappearing around corners, standing motionless in doorways. When I pursued, it vanished, but the temperature dropped in its wake, and that organic smell intensified until I gagged. Voices grew louder, more insistent. Not whispers now, but full conversations happening just beyond comprehension, as if separated by thin glass or speaking in languages that shared cadence but not meaning with English. They argued, pleaded, laughed, a cacophony that peaked between 3 and 4 a.m., the hour when reality felt thinnest. I stopped sleeping entirely those final nights. I'd sit in the living room, every light burning, watching shadows that shouldn't exist given the illumination. The footsteps circled me. Voices rose and fell in agitation. Doors throughout the house opened and closed in patterns that felt like Morse code for madness. Moving day arrived like salvation. I'd given notice weeks earlier, found a small apartment across town, somewhere with no history beyond anonymous suburban development. As I packed, the house's activity intensified to levels I hadn't thought possible. Every door slammed simultaneously. Footsteps thundered overhead despite the empty attic. Voices rose to screaming pitch. The shadows multiplied, rushing through rooms like ink spilled in water. The temperature plummeted despite the August heat. My breath misted as I carried boxes to the rental truck. Inside, the organic smell became overwhelming. Death and growth intertwined, sweet rot and bitter bloom. Pictures fell from walls. Furniture shifted. The house convulsed like a living thing rejecting poison. I worked faster, throwing belongings haphazardly into containers, abandoning organization for speed. The voices grew desperate, pleading in tones that transcended language barriers. The shadows pressed closer, and for the first time, I felt their touch. Cold, electric, wrong. They pulled at my clothes, my hair, trying to anchor me to that cursed space. The final load went into the truck as afternoon sun cast long shadows across the terrace row. I stood at the threshold one last time, keys in hand, looking back into the dimness beyond the doorway. The house had fallen silent, but it was the silence of held breath, of coiled potential. The shadows gathered in the hallway, dense and waiting. I set the keys on the entrance table and stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me. The lock clicked, a sound both final and insufficient. Through the window, shadows moved with purpose I'd never understand. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. Every window in the house stood open, though I'd closed them all. Dark shapes appeared briefly in each frame before the terrace row disappeared around a corner. The apartment provides peace, mostly. I sleep now, though dreams bring footsteps and whispers. Sometimes, walking past other old buildings, I feel that familiar chill, catch that organic scent, see shadows that move wrong. I've never returned to Elm Row, but I've researched obsessively. The house stands empty still. The landlord hasn't returned my security deposit or my calls. Last week, a former neighbor from the terrace row contacted me through social media. She wanted to know if I was all right, mentioned she'd been worried since that day she saw me moving out. She described watching me carry boxes while having animated conversations with no one, gesturing wildly at empty air, flinching from invisible contacts. She said I'd stood at the truck for 20 minutes, staring at the closed door, mouth moving in silent dialogue before driving away. I didn't correct her. Couldn't explain that the conversations had been responses, not initiations, that the gestures were defenses, not expressions, that the invisible contacts had left bruises which faded, but never fully disappeared from memory. The truth lived in that liminal space between madness and haunting, and I'd learned that some thresholds, once crossed, can never be clearly recrossed. The terrace house still invades my thoughts during vulnerable moments. The edge of sleep, the corner of vision, the silence between heartbeats. I wonder if it remains empty by choice or by necessity, if the shadows still rush through hallways, if voices still argue in impossible languages, if the next tenant will last longer than 6 months, or join the growing list of abbreviated leases and hasty retreats. Sometimes, late at night in my safe, sterile apartment, I hear footsteps overhead despite living on the top floor. Doors close in rooms I didn't enter. Shadows gather in corners where geometry shouldn't allow their existence. The organic smell returns, faint but unmistakable. And I wonder if the house ever truly let me leave, or if I carry pieces of it with me now. Seeds of something wrong that will grow wherever I try to plant new roots. The uncertainty gnaws worse than any certainty could, not knowing if the terrace house infected my perception or revealed truths I'd been blind to before. If madness is a door that, once opened, can never fully close. If shadows have always moved with purpose, and I'd simply never noticed until that house taught me to see. I avoid that part of town now, take longer routes that bypass Elm Row entirely, but geography provides limited protection from memories that transcend physical space. The terrace house lives in my peripheral vision, in the moment between waking and sleep, in the shadows that fall just slightly wrong when the light shifts. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I hear my name whispered in voices I almost recognize, calling me back to rooms I'll never enter again, to shadows that remember my shape, to a house that waits with infinite patience for my inevitable return. Story 4. The smell hits me first whenever it comes back. Not in dreams. I've stopped dreaming months ago, but in those hollow moments between consciousness and whatever darkness waits beneath. Copper and gasoline, sweet antifreeze and something else. Something that shouldn't exist in the catalog of scents a human mind can process. It's been 3 months since the Mustang call, and I still taste metal when I breathe too deep. I'm writing this down because the department shrink suggested it might help. She said trauma manifests in unexpected ways, that the mind creates patterns where none exist. But she wasn't there that night on Highway 49, didn't see what I saw in the twisted metal of that cherry red Mustang, didn't feel the air change when we pulled the boy from the driver's seat. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. Single vehicle accident, high speed, 2 occupants. My partner that night was working his last shift before retirement. 30 years of scraping humans off asphalt had finally worn him down to nothing but cigarette smoke and bitter coffee. He didn't say much when we loaded up, just muttered something about kids and horsepower being a bad combination. The scene was wrong from the moment we arrived. The Mustang had wrapped itself around an oak tree, but the damage pattern didn't match the physics. Metal bent in ways that suggested impact from multiple angles, as if the tree had reached out and pulled the car into its embrace. The headlights were still on, casting long shadows that moved independent of our flashlights, creating depth where there should have been flat surfaces. The girl was in the passenger seat, unconscious but breathing, her blonde hair matted with blood that looked black in the strobing emergency lights. The boy was trapped behind the wheel, his legs pinned by the crushed dashboard. His eyes were open, tracking our movements, but something in them had already gone distant, as if he was watching us from somewhere else entirely. My partner took the girl while I worked on the boy. Standard procedure: assess, stabilize, extract. But the moment I touched him, checking for a pulse at his carotid, the world tilted. His skin was fever hot, almost burning, and beneath my fingers, I swear I felt something moving that wasn't blood through veins. Something with its own rhythm, its own purpose. The boy's lips moved, and though no sound came out, I understood the words forming. She won't let go. I pulled my hand back, and the sensation stopped. My partner was already loading the girl onto a gurney, shouting for me to help with the extraction. We worked the hydraulic spreaders, peeling back metal like opening a can. And with each inch we gained, that smell grew stronger. Copper and gasoline, yes, but underneath it, something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. When we finally got him free, his body went rigid. Not a seizure. I've seen plenty of those. This was different, deliberate, as if every muscle was fighting against being removed from the wreckage. We got him on the backboard, into the rig, and I climbed in back while my partner drove. The ride to the hospital should have taken 12 minutes. My watch said it took 12 minutes. But inside that ambulance, time stretched and folded. The boy's vitals crashed 3 times, and 3 times I brought him back, each resurrection feeling more wrong than the last. His eyes never closed, just stared at the ceiling while I worked. And in their reflection, I saw things that couldn't have been there. Shapes moving in the ambulance that weren't medical equipment. Shadows that had substance and weight. The worst part was the girl. She was stable, unconscious on her gurney, but every time the boy's heart stopped, her hand would twitch. Just a small movement, fingers curling as if grasping for something. When his heart started again, her hand would relax. A neurological response to trauma, the rational part of my brain insisted. But the pattern was too perfect, too synchronized. By the 3rd arrest, I noticed the smell changing. The copper faded, replaced by something floral and cloying. The boy's mouth opened wider with each compression I performed, and I could see his throat working, as if something was trying to crawl out. Not vomit. I know what aspiration looks like. This was deliberate, purposeful movement from within. We reached the hospital, and they took both patients immediately. The boy went into surgery, the girl to trauma assessment. I stayed to give my report, standing in the harsh fluorescent lights of the ER, trying to explain the unexplainable to the attending physician. How do you document that a patient's skin temperature exceeded 104 degrees without fever? How do you note that his pupils dilated and contracted in patterns that matched no known neurological response? I went home that morning thinking it was over. Just another bad call, another night of witnessing how quickly physics and poor judgment can destroy young lives. But the smell followed me. Not constantly. That would have been easier to dismiss as olfactory hallucination. Instead, it came in waves, always when I was alone, always when I was still. The first time I saw her was a week later. I was restocking the rig after a routine call, checking expiration dates on medications, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a figure standing by the ambulance doors, blonde hair catching the garage's overhead lights. When I turned, nothing. But the smell intensified, and on the floor where I thought I'd seen her, there were wet footprints that evaporated as I watched. My partner noticed the change in me, started asking if I was sleeping, if I was eating. I lied, said everything was fine, but he'd been doing this too long to believe it. He pulled me aside one shift, told me about his early years, about the calls that stick with you, the ones that follow you home. He said the job takes pieces of you, replaces them with something harder but more brittle. I wanted to tell him this was different, that something had come back with me from that crash, but the words wouldn't form. The incidents escalated. Equipment in the rig would malfunction when I was alone. Monitors displaying vital signs when no one was connected. The defibrillator charging without being activated. Once, during a transport of an elderly woman with pneumonia, she grabbed my wrist and whispered that there was someone standing behind me, someone young and angry. When I turned, the smell hit so strong I nearly gagged. I started researching the crash, found the police report, the newspaper articles. The boy had survived surgery but remained in a coma. The girl had walked away with minor injuries, discharged after 2 days. But there were discrepancies. The skid marks suggested the car had been traveling straight, then suddenly veered directly into the tree. No evidence of steering correction, no attempt to brake, as if the car had been pulled. 3 weeks after the crash, I decided to visit the scene. I told myself it was to understand the mechanics better, to make sense of the physics that had bothered me. The tree still bore the scars, bark stripped away in a perfect imprint of the Mustang's front end. Standing there in the afternoon sun, everything looked normal, mundane even. Just a tree by a dangerous curve, the site of countless accidents over the years. But as the sun began to set, the shadows grew wrong. They stretched toward the road rather than away from it, reaching like fingers. And in the damaged bark, I could see patterns that looked almost like faces, features twisted in expressions I couldn't quite read. The smell returned, stronger than ever, and with it came a sound. Not quite whispering, not quite wind, but something between the two. I left quickly, but the image stayed. That night, I woke to find my bedroom filled with that floral copper smell, and in the darkness, I could swear I saw her standing at the foot of my bed. Not threatening, just watching, waiting. Her lips moved the same way the boys had. She won't let go. The department shrink says it's PTSD, that my mind is trying to process a traumatic event by creating a narrative that gives it meaning. She's prescribed sleep aids, suggested meditation, recommended time off, but she doesn't understand that time off makes it worse. When I'm working, when I'm focused on other calls, other patients, the presence fades to background static. It's in the quiet moments that she grows stronger. My partner retired last month. On his last day, he pulled me aside, gave me a long look, and said something that chilled me more than any ghostly presence could. He said he'd worked hundreds of crashes in his career, seen every type of trauma the road could dish out. But in 30 years, he'd only encountered 3 scenes where the physics didn't add up, where the damage suggested something beyond simple velocity and mass. All 3, he said, happened at the same tree on Highway 49. I've started checking the boy's status obsessively. Still in a coma, steady but unresponsive. The girl hasn't been back to visit him, at least not during regular hours, but the night nurses have reported strange things. Monitors showing 2 heartbeats when only 1 patient is in the room, the boy's eyes moving beneath closed lids in patterns that match no known REM cycle, and always, that smell of copper and gasoline permeating the ICU. Last night I worked a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate. 5 cars, numerous injuries, chaos and adrenaline drowning out everything else. But when we transported the most critical patient, a woman who'd been trapped for 40 minutes, she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and asked why there was a young girl standing behind me, why she was crying, why she kept reaching for something that wasn't there. I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because I finally understood what the boy had been trying to tell me, what those moving lips had been desperately attempting to communicate. Not, she won't let go, as in the girl won't let go. She won't let go of the tree won't let go of her. And now, having touched that burning skin, having felt what moves beneath it, having brought him back 3 times when perhaps I should have let him go, I'm tethered to whatever exists in that space between metal and wood, between life and whatever comes after. The smell is constant now. Copper and gasoline, flowers and something else. Something patient. Something hungry. Something that collects more than just crashed cars and broken bodies. I'm scheduled to work tomorrow night. Highway Patrol has already called in a single vehicle accident on Highway 49. A sedan this time, wrapped around a familiar tree. They're requesting immediate response. Multiple injuries suspected. I know I should refuse the call. Should claim illness, trade shifts, do anything to avoid returning to that stretch of road. But I also know it won't matter. Whatever I brought back with me, whatever followed me from that twisted Mustang, it's not bound by geography or duty rosters. The department shrink is wrong about trauma creating patterns where none exist. Sometimes patterns exist whether we acknowledge them or not. Sometimes the mind doesn't create meaning. It simply recognizes meaning that was always there, waiting in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moment between impact and aftermath. I can smell it getting stronger now, that mixture of mechanical failure and organic decay. My pen is trembling as I write this, not from fear but from something else. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Tomorrow night, I'll respond to that call. I'll work the scene, treat the injured, try to pull them back from whatever edge they're teetering on. But I know now that some edges aren't meant to be pulled back from. Some trees are more than wood and bark. Some crashes are more than physics and poor judgment. And some things, once touched, never stop reaching back. The smell is overwhelming now. Copper and gasoline, flowers and rot. In the reflection of my computer screen, I can see her standing behind me, mouth moving with words I'm beginning to understand. The tree is hungry. The tree has always been hungry. And now, so are you. Story 5. The rental agreement never mentioned the ditch. I found the house on a Tuesday, signed the papers on a Thursday, and moved my boxes into the small adobe-style place on the east side of El Paso by Saturday evening. The landlord, an elderly man with sun-weathered skin and tired eyes, handed me the keys without much ceremony. He mentioned the water heater's quirks, the temperamental air conditioning, the neighbor's dog that sometimes got loose. Never said a word about the irrigation ditch that ran behind the property, hidden behind a line of dried cottonwoods and chain-link fence. I didn't notice it until the first night. The insomnia had followed me from Phoenix. 3 months of it, stubborn and relentless since the incident at work that wasn't really an incident, but felt like one. My doctor suggested a change of scenery might help reset my sleep cycle. New city, new job, fresh start, the usual prescription for a mind that wouldn't shut down. At 3:47 a.m., I lay in the unfamiliar bedroom, staring at shadows cast by streetlight through thin curtains. The house settled around me with small creaks and sighs, the sounds of an old structure adjusting to the cooling desert night. I'd almost drifted off when I heard it. A wail, long and drawn out, rising from somewhere behind the house. My first thought was coyotes. El Paso sits on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert, and I'd read about wildlife occasionally wandering into residential areas. But the sound came again, and this time I caught the overlap. Multiple animals, their cries weaving together in a chorus that raised goosebumps along my forearms. Dogs, maybe, or cats. Something in distress. I got up, moved to the back window, and pulled the curtain aside. The backyard stretched maybe 30 feet before ending at a chain-link fence, beyond which I could make out the dark mass of trees. Nothing moved in the amber glow of the neighbor's security light. The animal sounds continued, but they seemed to come from beyond the fence, from the darkness beneath those trees. Then the screaming started. It cut through the animal wails like a blade, a woman's voice raw and desperate, forming words I couldn't quite make out at first. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pressed closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass. The voice came again, clearer now, and this time I understood. All my children. The words echoed across the empty yards, bouncing off concrete walls and carrying through the still air. The animal sounds intensified, as if responding to her cry. My heart hammered against my ribs. Someone was in trouble. Someone needed help. I grabbed my phone, pulled on shoes, and headed for the back door. The desert air hit me with its dry chill, so different from Phoenix's heat that never quite left even at night. I crossed the yard quickly, my phone's flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me. The fence was old but sturdy, about 6 feet high. Beyond it, I could see the ditch now, a concrete channel maybe 20 feet wide, mostly dry except for a trickle of water reflecting my light. The screaming had stopped. So had the animal sounds. The silence felt heavy, expectant. I called out, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the darkness, asked if anyone needed help. The words disappeared into the night without echo. Nothing answered. I stood there for several minutes, playing my light across the ditch and the cottonwoods, seeing nothing but shadows and the glint of broken glass scattered along the concrete. Eventually, the cold drove me back inside. I locked the door, checked it twice, and returned to bed. Sleep didn't come. I lay there until dawn, listening. The second night, I was ready. I'd spent the day researching the area, learning about the irrigation system that crisscrossed El Paso's older neighborhoods. The ditches, called acequias by locals, had been part of the desert landscape for generations, carrying water from the Rio Grande to farmland and orchards. Most were dry now, obsolete remnants of agricultural history. serving mainly as channels for storm runoff and collecting points for trash. I'd also learned about La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. The legend appeared in dozens of versions across the Southwest, but the core remained constant, a woman who drowned her children and now wandered waterways, wailing for them, sometimes trying to drag others down in their place. Every culture had their version of the story, and El Paso's Mexican-American community kept the tale alive, passing it down through generations. Just a legend, a cautionary tale parents told to keep kids away from dangerous water. Still, I set my alarm for 3:30 a.m. When it went off, I was already awake. The insomnia had me in its grip, my mind racing through work emails and conversations I'd replayed 1,000 times. I silenced the alarm and waited. 3:47 a.m., almost exactly. The animals started first, that same overlapping chorus of distressed cries. I was at the window before the woman's scream began, watching the darkness beyond my fence. This time I noticed details I'd missed before, the way the security light from next door flickered just before the sound started. The way my own breath came faster, anticipating. The scream, when it came, seemed closer, louder. All my children, all my children. I had my shoes on, phone in hand, and was out the door in seconds. But this time I was thinking more clearly, noting the direction, the acoustics, trying to pinpoint the source. The cry seemed to move along the ditch, traveling from west to east, maintaining the same desperate pitch. At the fence, I aimed my light down into the channel. The thin stream of water looked darker tonight, almost black in the LED's white glare. Something moved in the shadows beneath the cottonwoods, a flutter of pale fabric, a suggestion of movement. I called out again. The movement stopped. The screaming stopped. Even the animal sounds cut off mid-wail, leaving only silence and the pounding of my pulse in my ears. My light caught something on the far side of the ditch, a dress, a white or maybe cream-colored, hanging from a low branch like someone had discarded it there. No one wore it, just the dress, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel from where I stood. I kept my light trained on it for a long time, watching for any further movement. The dress hung still now, as if it had never moved at all. When my phone battery warning chimed, I finally went inside. The third night, I didn't wait for 3:47. Something was wrong with me. I knew that. Recognized the signs from before when the pressure at work had started building and my thoughts had begun spiraling into obsessive loops. I'd catch myself checking the same numbers repeatedly, convinced I'd made an error. Replaying conversations, certain I'd said something wrong. The therapist I'd seen, briefly before I'd convinced myself I didn't need help, had called it anxiety with obsessive features. Suggested medication. I'd declined. Now I found myself watching the clock, waiting for the numbers to align into that specific configuration. 3:47. I'd looked it up, searched for significance, found nothing except that it was just a time, like any other, except it wasn't anymore. Not to me. At 3:30, I was already dressed and standing at the back door, my hand on the knob. My reflection in the glass looked hollow-eyed, shadows pooling beneath my cheekbones. I looked like I felt, like something had been scraped out of me, leaving only the edges. The animals began early tonight. 3:38 by my phone's clock. Their cries layered over each other, building in intensity, and I realized I could pick out individual voices now. A dog's howl, cats yowling, something that might have been a bird or maybe a rabbit caught by a predator. The sounds of suffering, of prey and predator, of the violent small deaths that happened in darkness everywhere, every night, unremarked. But there was a pattern to it, a rhythm, almost musical if you listened right, if you let your mind soften its grip on reason and just heard the sound for what it was, notes in a composition, building towards something. At 3:47, the woman's voice joined the symphony. I was outside before I'd consciously decided to move. The fence was an obstacle I barely noticed as I climbed it, my hands finding purchase on the chain link, my shoes wedging into the diamond-shaped gaps. I'd done some climbing in my 20s, before work consumed everything, and the muscle memory remained. I was over and down in seconds, my feet hitting the concrete slope of the ditch. The scream echoed around me now, seeming to come from everywhere at once. All my children, all my children. The words bounced off the concrete walls, layered and overlapping until I couldn't tell if it was one voice or many. My phone's light swept across the ditch. The trickle of water looked thicker tonight, moving faster, though I couldn't imagine where the flow was coming from. The dress I'd seen hanging from the branch was gone. In its place, I saw a figure standing in the water, pale in my light, too pale, wearing that cream-colored dress that hung in tatters around bare feet. Long, dark hair obscured the face. The figure stood motionless, facing away from me, toward the direction the water flowed. My voice stuck in my throat. I took a step forward, and my foot splashed in water that came up past my ankle. When had it gotten so deep? The concrete beneath felt slick, unstable. The figure turned. I never saw the face. My phone's light died at that moment, plunging me into darkness so complete, I felt it press against my eyes. The screaming intensified, filling my skull, and I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that I couldn't tell anymore if the sound came from outside or from inside my own head. Hands grabbed me from behind, strong hands, rough and real, hauling me backward. I fought them instinctively, thrashing, but they held firm. A voice in my ear, male, accented, urgent, told me to stop, to hold still, that I was going to hurt myself. Light blazed around us. Flashlights, several of them, and I saw I wasn't in the ditch at all. I was in my own backyard, on the ground, my legs tangled in something. The fence. I'd been climbing the fence, apparently, trying to get over it. 3 people stood around me. The elderly landlord, a woman I didn't recognize, and a man in a security uniform. The landlord's weathered face looked grim in the flashlight's glare. He asked if I was all right, if I knew where I was. I nodded, though I wasn't sure of either answer. My pants were wet to the knees. My hands were scraped raw, bleeding from where I'd gripped the fence. The woman, who introduced herself as a neighbor from 3 houses down, mentioned she'd seen me outside every night around 4 in the morning, had been worried, had called the landlord when she'd seen me climbing the fence tonight, clearly in some kind of state. The security guard, who apparently patrolled the area, noted that I was lucky they'd gotten to me when they did. The ditch had been dry for months, but there were homeless camps down there sometimes, and it wasn't safe, especially at night. I listened to them talk, their voices reasonable and concerned, and I nodded at appropriate moments. But I could still hear it underneath their words, that distant wailing, those animal cries, and the woman's voice screaming for her children. The landlord helped me inside, suggested I get some rest, maybe see a doctor. The concern in his eyes looked genuine, but there was something else there too. Recognition, maybe, like he'd seen this before. Before he left, he paused at the door, mentioned almost casually that the previous tenant had broken their lease early, moved out in the middle of the night without collecting their deposit. He'd found them at the fence, just like me, trying to get to the ditch, swore they'd heard someone calling for help. He didn't say anything more, just wished me good night and closed the door behind him. It's been 4 weeks now. The insomnia hasn't improved, but I've learned to manage it differently. I moved my mattress to the front bedroom where I can't see the backyard or the fence or the darkness beyond. I wear earplugs every night, the expensive kind that block everything. I keep my phone in another room so I'm not tempted to check the time, but I know when it's 3:47 a.m. I feel it in my body, a tightness in my chest, a buzzing in my teeth. The earplugs don't help. I can still hear them, muffled but present. The animals and the woman, conducting their nightly ritual in the darkness. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really climbed that fence, if the landlord and the neighbors actually came, or if that's just another story I tell myself to explain the scraped hands and wet clothes. Memory is a strange thing when you haven't slept properly in months. It bends, distorts, fills in gaps with plausible fictions. The doctor I finally consented to see prescribed medication, little white pills I'm supposed to take every evening. They sit in the bottle on my bathroom counter, and every night I consider taking one. Every night I choose not to, because the pills will make me sleep, and if I sleep, I won't be awake to hear. And I need to hear. That's what I've come to understand in these weeks of careful observation, of lying still and listening through my expensive earplugs that don't work. Someone is calling. Someone is in distress. Whether she's real or legend or something my fractured mind has conjured from insomnia and stress and the particular darkness of the desert night, it doesn't matter. The calling is real to me, and that makes it real enough. Last night I took the earplugs out, turned off all the lights, sat at the back window and waited. When 3:47 came, I listened without fear or confusion. The animal sounds rose in their familiar pattern. The woman's voice joined them, that same desperate cry, "All my children." And for the first time, I understood what she was really saying. Not all my children, as in, where are all my children? Or, look what happened to all my children. She was calling them, all her children, all of us who hear her in the night, who climb fences and wade into empty ditches, who move to new cities and carry our insomnia like stones in our pockets. We're the ones she's calling. Tonight, I think I'm going to answer. The fence isn't as high as it looks. The ditch isn't as deep. And somewhere down there in the darkness, beneath the cottonwoods where the water runs or doesn't run depending on what version of the night I'm living in, she's waiting. I can hear her now. Even in the daylight, even with my earplugs in, even when I'm at work or at the grocery store or driving down the highway with the radio loud, she's always there, just underneath everything else, calling and calling. All my children, I'm coming. Story 6. The teepee stood like a pale finger pointing at the star-scattered sky, canvas walls trembling in the evening wind that swept across the ranch's eastern pasture. I'd pitched it 3 hours before sunset, following the trail my brother-in-law had mentioned during our last phone call, the one that wound through the property's most isolated section, where the creek bent around a copse of twisted oaks, and the land rolled away in gentle swells toward nothing but darkness. The ranch belonged to his family, though he rarely used it anymore. When he'd offered me the keys, mentioning something about needing someone to check on the place, I'd jumped at the chance. 3 days alone, no cell service, no neighbors for miles. Just me, the land, and the kind of silence you can't find anywhere near the city. That was before the figure on the trail. I'd seen it during my final walk before dark, when the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the world had taken on that peculiar twilight quality where shadows pool in unexpected places. I'd been following the creek, watching the water catch the last copper light, when something made me look up toward the trail that ran parallel to my route, about 50 yards distant through the sparse grass. The shape stood motionless at the crest of a small rise, human or human-like. The distinction matters now, though it didn't occur to me in that moment. From that distance, I'd assumed it was another camper, maybe someone else with permission to use the property. I'd raised my hand in greeting, a reflexive gesture. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't returned the wave. Just stood there, a dark outline against the deepening purple sky. I'd called out, my voice swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the open land. No response. The figure remained perfectly still, and something about that absolute immobility had sent a cold thread of unease through my chest. People don't stand that still. They shift weight, adjust their stance, move in small unconscious ways that signal life and awareness. This didn't. I told myself it was a trick of the fading light, a fence post or dead tree that my mind had shaped into human form. The brain does that, especially in low light. Pareidolia, seeing patterns where none exist. By the time I'd looked away to check my footing on the uneven ground and looked back, the figure was gone. Just gone. Now sitting in the teepee with my camping lantern casting dancing shadows on the canvas walls, I couldn't shake the memory of that silhouette. The rational part of my mind kept circling back to the explanation I'd settled on during my walk back to camp. A trick of light, a misidentified object, nothing more. But rationality feels thin out here, where the darkness presses close and the wind makes the canvas snap and flutter like something alive and breathing. I'd eaten a cold dinner, Couldn't muster the energy to build a fire after that walk, and tried to read by lantern light. The book remained open on my lap, but I hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. Every sound from outside seemed amplified, pregnant with meaning. The grass rustling, the distant call of a night bird, the creak of oak branches moving in the breeze. And underneath it all, a feeling I couldn't name. Not quite fear, not yet. More like anticipation, like standing at the edge of a pool and knowing you're about to fall in. That moment of suspension before the inevitable plunge. The first scratch came at 11:15. I'd been lying on my sleeping bag, still dressed, staring at the teepee's peak where the support poles converged. The sound was soft, deliberate. Not the random brush of wind-blown debris, but something that moved with purpose. It started near the base of the teepee, a dragging sound like fingernails or branches being pulled across the canvas in a slow, searching arc. I sat up, heart suddenly hammering. The lantern had dimmed, and I reached to adjust it with shaking hands, flooding the interior with harsh white light. The shadows retreated to the corners, but the sound continued, working its way around the teepee's circumference. Scratch, drag, pause, scratch, drag. My brother-in-law had mentioned wildlife, deer, coyotes, the occasional fox. Could be a curious animal, I told myself, investigating this strange new structure in its territory. But animals don't move with that kind of methodical precision. They're erratic, easily spooked. This moved like it was examining, testing, searching for a way in. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the teepee's entrance flap in one quick motion, sweeping the beam across the immediate area. Empty pasture greeted me, the grass silvered by starlight, moving in waves with the wind. No animals, no debris, nothing that could account for the sound. But the scratching had stopped the moment I opened the flap. I kept the light on, panning it across the landscape in wider and wider arcs. The creek gurgled somewhere in the darkness. The oaks swayed, their twisted limbs creating a tangle of moving shadows. Beyond them, the trail stretched away like a pale scar across the dark land. And I thought about the figure I'd seen earlier, thought about how it had vanished without a trace. The cold settled deeper into my chest. I retreated into the teepee and zipped the flap, suddenly hyper-aware of how thin the canvas walls were. They wouldn't keep anything out, wouldn't even slow something down. They were psychological barriers at best, the illusion of shelter without its substance. For the next hour, I sat rigid on my sleeping bag, listening. The wind had picked up, and the teepee walls flexed and snapped, creating their own catalog of sounds. Several times I was certain I heard footsteps circling the structure, soft, careful, almost hesitant. But each time I grabbed the flashlight and looked, there was nothing. Just wind and grass and the vast indifference of the empty land. The rational explanations were still there, still accessible. Heightened awareness making normal sounds seem sinister. Isolation playing tricks on an urban mind, unused to true darkness and silence. The power of suggestion after seeing something unexplained on the trail. I recited these explanations like a mantra, but they felt increasingly hollow. Because there was something else now, something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The feeling of being watched. Not the vague paranoia that comes with being alone in a strange place. This was specific, focused, undeniable. The same feeling you get when someone stares at you in a crowded room and you turn to meet their eyes. That prickle of awareness, that instinctive knowledge of attention being paid. Except there was no one to turn and face. Just the canvas walls and the darkness beyond, and the certainty that something on the other side was observing, waiting, measuring. At 1:30, the scratching returned. This time it was different, harder, more insistent. The sound moved up the side of the teepee, and I watched in frozen horror as the canvas bulged inward, pushed by something outside, not dramatically, just a subtle depression, as if someone was running their hand along the wall, feeling the shape of the structure, the tension of the fabric. The bulge traveled upward, impossibly high. 6 feet, 7, 8, following the curve of the teepee walls toward the peak. Whatever was outside was tall, or climbing, or I couldn't finish the thought. The lantern flickered. Once, twice. The batteries were fresh, had been fine all evening, but now the light guttered and dimmed, plunging the interior into semi-darkness. In that reduced illumination, the moving bulge in the canvas became monstrous, a shape that suggested limbs but in wrong proportions, joints that bent in directions that made my eyes hurt to follow. Then it hit the canvas. Not a scratch this time. A solid impact, like a palm slapping flat against the fabric. The entire teepee shuddered with the force of it. Another hit, from a different angle. Another. They came in rapid succession, circling the structure, each impact accompanied by that dragging sound, as if whatever was hitting the walls was also pulling at them, testing their strength. I'd grabbed my phone without thinking, muscle memory from years of urban living. No signal, of course, but the screen's glow seemed to anger whatever was outside. The impacts increased in violence, and now there was sound with them. Not words exactly, but something that might have been an attempt at vocalization. Wet, breathy, wrong, like someone trying to speak through a throat not designed for human language. The rational part of my mind had shut down entirely. This wasn't wind, wasn't animals, wasn't misperception or isolation-induced paranoia. This was real, physical, immediate. Something was outside the teepee, something that wanted in or wanted me to come out, and I had no idea what it was or what it wanted or how to make it stop. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything went silent. The wind died. The impacts ceased. Even the creek's gurgle seemed to fade, as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. In that absolute silence, I heard something far worse than any of the preceding sounds. Breathing, right outside the teepee's entrance. Slow, measured breaths that I could hear through the thin canvas. Not labored, not rushed. Patient. The breathing of something that could wait as long as necessary, that had all the time in the world, that knew I couldn't stay inside forever. I don't know how long I sat there listening to that breathing. Minutes. Hours. Time had become meaningless, stretched and distorted. The lantern had died completely, leaving only my phone's fading screen for light. I watched the battery percentage drop. 40%, 35, 30, and knew that when it died, I'd be in complete darkness with that thing still outside. At some point, exhaustion must have overwhelmed fear. I came back to consciousness with dawn's gray light filtering through the canvas, my neck cramped from falling asleep sitting upright, my phone dead in my lap. The morning sounded normal. Birds calling, wind rustling grass, the creek's familiar burble. I unzipped the entrance with trembling hands and stepped out into the early light. The grass around the teepee was undisturbed. No tracks, no marks in the soft earth where something had circled the structure. No broken branches or displaced stones. Nothing to indicate that anything had been there at all. I'd packed my gear in 15 minutes, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the tent poles. The walk back to my car felt like wading through deep water, every step requiring conscious effort. I'd kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trail and the tree line and the open pasture, but nothing moved in the morning light except the wind through the grass. But as I'd reached the car and thrown my pack in the trunk, I'd noticed something. Scratches on the teepee's canvas. Long, parallel marks, too deliberate to be accidental, too deep to be from wind-blown debris. They ran from the base to well above head height, and there were dozens of them, circling the entire structure. I'd stood there staring at those marks for a long time, my keys dangling from nerveless fingers, trying to reconcile what I saw with what I remembered. Had they been there when I'd pitched the teepee? Had I somehow done it myself in some fugue state during the night? The explanations felt absurd even as I grasped for them. Before getting in the car, I'd looked back at the trail one final time. The figure was there again. Same spot. Same absolute stillness. In the morning light, I could see more details, the wrong proportions, the way it seemed to blur at the edges, as if reality couldn't quite decide on its exact shape. And though I was at least 100 yards away, I could feel its attention like a physical weight. It raised one arm, or something like an arm, in a mirror of my greeting from the previous evening. A wave. Slow, deliberate, mocking. I'd driven away with my hands locked on the wheel, not allowing myself to look in the rearview mirror until the ranch was miles behind me. Even then, part of me expected to see it standing in the road, that impossible figure, waiting with infinite patience. Now, a week later, I'm back in my apartment with its locked doors and artificial lights. I haven't told my brother-in-law about the scratches on the teepee, haven't mentioned what I saw on the trail. What would I say? That something visited my camp? That I felt watched? That I heard breathing outside my tent and found evidence that corroborated the experience? He'd have explanations. Rational ones. Better ones than I can construct. And part of me wants to believe them. Wants to chalk the whole experience up to an overactive imagination and the disorientation of true isolation. But I can't. Because sometimes, late at night when the city is as quiet as it ever gets, I feel it again. That specific, focused attention. The certainty of being observed. And when I look out my window at the street below, there's occasionally a figure standing under the streetlight across from my building. Too far away to see clearly. Too still to be entirely human. It never moves. Just stands there. Watching. Waiting. And I wonder, with a cold certainty that has settled into my bones like frost, if I brought something back with me from that ranch. Or if something followed me home. Or if, and this is the thought that keeps me awake until dawn breaks, it was already here, already watching. And that night on the ranch was just when it decided to let me know. The scratches on the teepee proved something happened. They're physical evidence, undeniable and real. But they don't answer the question that matters most. What made them? I don't know. And I'm increasingly certain I don't want to know. Because some answers, I'm learning, are worse than the questions they resolve. Some knowledge changes you in ways you can't undo. The teepee is in my storage unit, packed away in its bag. I haven't looked at it since that morning. Haven't unzipped the bag to examine those scratches more closely, though the impulse gnaws at me sometimes. Because part of me, the part that still clings to rationality, that needs explanations and evidence, wants to see them again, to photograph them, to prove to myself it really happened. But a deeper part, the part that listened to that breathing outside the canvas, knows better. Some things should stay packed away. Some evidence should remain unexamined, because looking too closely might draw attention again, might signal interest, might be taken as an invitation, and whatever was on that trail, whatever circled my camp in the darkness, whatever pressed its presence against the thin canvas walls and left its marks for me to find, it's still out there, still watching, still waiting for me to look back. Story 7. The windowsill was still warm when I touched it that afternoon, as if someone had been leaning there moments before. My hand trembled as I pulled the window shut, checking the lock 3 times before stepping back. The carpet beneath showed the small impressions where my son had stood, toes pressed against the baseboard, hands presumably reaching for the frame. My wife had found him there 20 minutes earlier, perched and ready, the window yawning open to the autumn air 4 stories above the courtyard. She'd grabbed him just as he began to lean forward. The sound of her scream still echoed in the apartment, trapped in the corners where afternoon light couldn't reach. He'd said a girl told him to come on, that she was waiting for him outside. When we asked him to describe her, he just smiled that distant smile children get when they're only half present, and said she had a nice voice, soft like bedtime. That was the phrase he'd used, soft like bedtime, and something about those words made my spine contract. The building manager stood in our doorway that evening, his face arranged in practiced concern. No children lived in 4B, he assured us. Never had. Not in the 15 years he'd worked there. The apartment next door housed a retired couple who traveled extensively. They'd been in Arizona for the past 6 weeks. He showed me documentation as if I'd demanded proof, his fingers leaving smudges on the paper. The apartment was empty, locked, completely vacant. He suggested my son had imagined it, Perhaps something from a dream bleeding into waking life the way children's fantasies sometimes did. But I'd seen the window. We always kept it locked. Always. I began watching 4B after that. Subtle surveillance, nothing obsessive. Or so I told myself. I'd pause in the hallway when taking out the trash, listening at their door for sounds of movement. Nothing ever emerged except the hollow silence of unoccupied space. Yet twice I could have sworn I saw the briefest flicker of shadow beneath the door gap, that sliver of darkness between wood and floor, where light should have shone through from their windows. My wife wanted to move immediately. She started checking rental listings compulsively, her laptop screen glowing in the dark bedroom at 3 a.m. But I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't solve anything, that whatever had called to my son through that window wouldn't be left behind with a change of address. The thought had worked its way into my skull and nested there, laying eggs that hatched into smaller, skittering anxieties. I requested the building's history from the municipal archives, claiming I was researching local architecture for a project. The clerk handed me a thin folder containing construction permits and a handful of newspaper clippings. The building had gone up in 1972. Nothing remarkable about it except for a brief mention in 1989 when renovations updated the fourth-floor units. The article was frustratingly vague, mentioning structural improvements and modernization without elaborating. Between the lines, I sensed something unsaid, the way you can feel cold air seeping through a sealed window. Then I found the incident report, tucked between utility records. August 1990. A maintenance worker had refused to enter 4B after his third scheduled repair visit, claiming he heard a voice calling him toward the windows whenever he worked there. The report ended abruptly with a note that the worker had been transferred to a different property. No follow-up, no explanation. The file trembled in my hands. In the archive's fluorescent lighting, the paper seemed thinner than it should be, almost translucent, as if the words themselves were trying to fade into nothing. That night, I stood in our apartment with all the lights off, staring at the wall that separated us from 4B. The building's usual sounds, water in pipes, footsteps above, the elevator's mechanical groan, faded into background static. I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the texture of the paint, the slight coolness of the drywall beneath. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I felt it. The faintest vibration, rhythmic and regular. Like breathing. Like something on the other side matching its respiration to mine, rising and falling in synchronization. I jerked my hand away, but the sensation lingered on my skin. A phantom pressure that wouldn't dissipate even when I rubbed my palm against my jeans. My wife found me there in the darkness and asked what I was doing. Her voice came from very far away, though she stood only a few feet behind me. I told her I was checking for mice in the walls, and she accepted this lie with the exhausted relief of someone who didn't want to know the truth. She'd been sleeping poorly, I'd noticed. Dark circles had colonized the skin beneath her eyes, and she'd started that thing where she'd pause mid-conversation, head tilted as if listening to something just below the threshold of hearing. The building manager called 3 days later. The couple from 4B had decided to sell. They wanted to list immediately, weren't even planning to return to PAC. They'd arranged for an estate company to handle everything remotely, box up their possessions, ship what they wanted to keep. Something about the hastiness of this decision struck me as significant, though I couldn't articulate why. People moved abruptly all the time. People had reasons. I started waking at 3:47 every morning. The specificity of the time bothered me more than the waking itself. Not 3:45, not 3:50, but precisely 3:47, as if something was setting an alarm I couldn't hear. I'd lie there in the dark, skin prickling with awareness, listening to the apartment breathe around me. Sometimes I thought I heard that soft voice drifting through the walls, so faint it might have been blood moving through my own ears. "Come on," it seemed to whisper. "Come on." During one of these vigils, I realized I could hear my son talking in his sleep. His room was down the hall, door closed, but the words reached me with crystalline clarity. He was having a conversation, his voice rising and falling in response to questions I couldn't hear. The cadence was wrong, too mature, as if he were mimicking adult speech patterns. When I crept to his doorway and eased it open, he was sitting up in bed, eyes closed, smiling at the window. The window was locked. I'd checked it myself before he went to sleep, but his face was turned toward it with the rapt attention of someone watching something beautiful, something he desperately wanted to reach. I carried him back to his pillow, and he murmured something about how patient she was, how she said she'd wait as long as it took, because time worked differently where she was. The words poured out in a drowsy stream, and I had to resist the urge to cover his mouth, to stop whatever was trying to speak through him. The estate sale happened on a Saturday. I told my wife I needed to check it out, maybe pick up some furniture for the guest room we'd been meaning to furnish. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't parse, something between concern and resignation, and told me to be careful. The way she said it made it clear she wasn't talking about lifting heavy objects or spending too much money. 4B's door stood open when I arrived, and I stepped into a space that felt fundamentally wrong. The layout was identical to ours, but everything was subtly off. Angles that shouldn't exist in the corners, shadows pooling in places where light should have been direct. The furniture had been cleared except for a few pieces marked for sale, leaving the apartment feeling cavernous and exposed. Other people wandered through, commenting on the crown molding and the view, but they all moved quickly, spending no more than a few minutes before migrating back to the hallway. I was the only one who lingered, drawn toward the bedroom that corresponded to my son's room in our unit. The window was open, not just unlocked, fully open, curtains drifting in a breeze that felt too warm for October. I approached slowly, each step requiring conscious effort, fighting the urge to turn and leave. The windowsill showed wear patterns, wood rubbed smooth in two places about shoulder-width apart, as if someone had spent countless hours leaning there, looking out, or perhaps looking in. When I peered over the edge, the courtyard seemed farther away than it should be, the perspective warped and vertiginous. A shape stood near the building's entrance, too distant to make out clearly, but I had the unshakable conviction that it was looking up at me, looking up and waiting. The figure appeared to be female, though I couldn't identify any specific features that confirmed this. Just an outline, really. Just a silhouette that remained perfectly still while everything around it moved with the wind and the day's activity. Something made me grip the window frame, fingers settling into those worn grooves that fit my hands too perfectly. The distance suddenly seemed negotiable, the air itself taking on a viscous quality that suggested it might hold me, might support my weight if I just leaned out far enough to test it. The voice came then, not from outside, but from somewhere behind my thoughts, intimate and invasive. Soft like bedtime, exactly as my son had described it. "Come on," it said. "I've been waiting." My phone rang, the sound so jarringly mundane that I staggered backward, releasing my grip on the frame. My wife's name flashed on the screen. I answered without thinking, and her voice grounded me instantly. She was asking about dinner, about what time I'd be home, about whether I'd found anything worth buying. Normal questions, ordinary questions, the kind of questions that exist in a world where windows are just windows and voices belong to people who actually exist. I told her I was leaving, that there was nothing there I wanted. This was true in a way that made my throat tight. When I glanced back at the courtyard, the figure was gone. But the sensation of being observed didn't fade. If anything, it intensified, as if whatever had been waiting outside had simply moved to a different vantage point. I fled the apartment, passing the estate sale coordinator without explanation. She called after me about a lamp I'd been considering, but her voice couldn't penetrate the ringing in my ears, that high-pitched whine that might have been tinnitus, or might have been something else, some frequency just beyond normal hearing. The building manager stood in the lobby when I reached the ground floor. He asked if I'd found anything interesting upstairs, and the way he phrased it, interesting, not useful or attractive, made me search his face for hidden meaning. His eyes were rheumy and tired, the eyes of someone who'd seen things he'd learned not to mention. We stood in silence for a moment, and I wondered if he was waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge what we both knew but couldn't articulate. Instead, I asked him about the renovations in 1989. What exactly had they done to the fourth floor? He blinked slowly, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said they'd sealed some openings in the walls, filled in spaces that shouldn't have existed according to the original blueprints. Gaps between the units where the architecture didn't quite line up. He said it as if this was perfectly normal, as if buildings regularly contained impossible spaces that needed filling. When they sealed the gaps, he continued, some residents complained about sounds, scratching in the walls, voices calling through vents. But eventually everyone adjusted, and the complaints stopped. People moved on. People always moved on. He looked at me then, with something like sympathy, and I realized he knew what I'd experienced in 4B. Perhaps he'd experienced it himself. Perhaps everyone who'd lived adjacent to that apartment had felt it. That pull toward the windows. That soft voice promising something just out of reach. I left him standing there and took the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the physical exertion to anchor me in my body. 4 flights of concrete and metal, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell, each echo sounding almost like footsteps following just out of sight. When I reached our floor and stepped into the hallway, the door to 4B was closed again, the estate sale apparently concluded, but I could feel it there, waiting on the other side. Waiting with infinite patience, the kind of patience that comes from existing in a place where time works differently. My wife was in the kitchen when I entered our apartment, and the normalcy of the scene, her at the counter chopping vegetables, afternoon light streaming through clean windows, felt like a fiction I was participating in, a pretense we were both maintaining. She asked me about my morning, and I told her I hadn't bought anything, that I'd just looked around. What I didn't tell her was that I could still feel the window frame's grooves impressed into my palms, that I could still hear that voice curling through my thoughts like smoke, patient and persistent, that some part of me, a part I was terrified to examine too closely, had wanted to lean further, to test whether the air would hold me, to see what was waiting in that impossible space between windows. Our son was in his room, playing quietly. I checked on him and found him arranging toys on his bed, his back to the window that was locked. The window that I'd checked 3 times that morning, and would check 3 times again before bed tonight and every night after. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was something in his eyes I didn't recognize, a depth that shouldn't exist in a child's gaze. She says you almost came, he told me matter-of-factly, returning to his toys. She says you'll try again. Everyone does, eventually. I wanted to ask who she was, but the question lodged in my throat, because I already knew, in the way you know things in nightmares, that she wasn't a who at all. She was something that had found an opening, a gap in the architecture where the building didn't quite align with reality. And when they'd sealed those gaps in 1989, they hadn't eliminated her. They'd just trapped her between the walls, compressed her into the spaces where apartments met, where she waited in patient stillness for anyone who might hear her call. That night, I pressed my ear against the wall we shared with 4B and listened. At first, only silence. Then, gradually, I detected it, breathing that matched my own, synchronizing with my rhythm, rising and falling in perfect time. And beneath that, almost imperceptible, a voice. Soft like bedtime, soft like forgetting, soft like the moment before you step into nothing. Come on, it whispered. I'm still waiting. The wall was warm beneath my cheek, warm like skin, like something alive had been pressed against the other side for hours, waiting for me to listen. I stayed there until my wife found me and gently pulled me away, her hands on my shoulders firm and real and grounding. But even now, weeks later, I can feel it. That pull, that patient invitation. The windows in our apartment remain locked, but I know, the way you know things that bypass rational thought, that locks only work if both sides respect them. And whatever waits in the spaces between our walls, whatever watches from those impossible gaps in the architecture, doesn't acknowledge such human constructs as locks or barriers, or the distinction between inside and outside. Sometimes at 3:47 in the morning, I wake to find myself standing at my son's window, my hands resting in grooves that shouldn't exist in the frame, grooves worn smooth by countless hands before mine. And in the courtyard below, a figure stands looking up, patient and still, waiting for the moment when I finally stop pulling myself back, when I finally let myself lean far enough to discover what she's been trying to show me all along. The building manager was right. Eventually, everyone adjusts. Eventually, everyone moves on. Or perhaps they move in a different direction entirely, toward windows that open onto spaces that shouldn't exist, toward voices that call from the gaps in the walls, toward that soft promise of somewhere else, somewhere that waits with infinite patience for anyone who'll finally answer yes, who'll finally say they're ready to come on. I'm not sure which possibility terrifies me more. Story 8. The checkpoint materialized from the fog like something pulled from murky water. Sudden, inevitable, impossible to avoid. Red and blue lights fractured through my windshield, turning the October mist into a kaleidoscope of Jing warning. I eased my foot off the accelerator, feeling the Corolla's engine settle into a reluctant idle as I joined the line of vehicles crawling toward the officers stationed beneath portable floodlights that carved harsh white circles in the darkness. 3 cars ahead. The night pressed against my windows, thick and viscous. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, taking back roads from the conference upstate, trying to avoid the interstate's monotonous hum that always made me drowsy. The clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m., that dead hour when the world feels evacuated, when even gas stations look like abandoned stage sets. 2 cars ahead. Through my windshield, I watched an officer lean into a sedan's window, his flashlight beam dancing across the interior. The driver's hands were visible on the steering wheel, positioned at 10 and 2 like everyone does at these stops. That universal gesture of compliance and sobriety. I checked my own hands. Steady, clean, wrapped around the wheel with perhaps too much pressure. My knuckles had gone pale. 1 car ahead. That's when I felt it for the first time. A presence, like someone standing just outside my peripheral vision. The sensation crawled across the back of my neck, cold and insistent. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind me dissolved into fog and darkness. The mirror itself seemed wrong somehow, reflecting light at angles that didn't quite match the checkpoint's illumination. Then I was at the front, and an officer was tapping on my window with 1 knuckle. I rolled it down. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and something else, something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in standing water. The officer's face was professionally neutral, his eyes scanning my vehicle's interior with practiced efficiency. He asked for my license and registration, and I produced them with hands that surprised me by remaining steady. He examined the documents with his flashlight, then looked past me, toward the passenger seat, then the back seat, his beam lingering there longer than seemed necessary. The officer told me he'd noticed I was driving below the speed limit. His tone suggested this was somehow more suspicious than speeding. I explained about the long drive, the fatigue, my preference for caution on unfamiliar rural roads. He asked if I'd been drinking, and I said no, which was true. I'd had nothing but gas station coffee and stale protein bars for the past 6 hours. He asked me to step out of the vehicle. The asphalt felt unsteady beneath my feet, though I knew it was solid. Another officer approached, younger, his hand resting casually near his belt. The first officer asked me to perform a series of sobriety tests. Walk a straight line, stand on 1 foot, follow his finger with my eyes. I completed each one, feeling absurdly like a trained animal performing tricks. The second officer circled my car slowly, his flashlight examining the exterior. That's when he stopped. His beam pointed upward, illuminating my Corolla's roof. The younger officer called his partner over. They both stared at something above my vehicle, their expressions shifting from professional vigilance to something I couldn't quite identify. Confusion mixed with unease. The first officer asked me with strange, careful emphasis if anyone else had been in the car with me. I told him no. I'd been alone since leaving the conference center at 8 p.m. He asked again, his voice different now, tighter. Had anyone been on top of the vehicle? Had I picked up any hitchhikers? Had I stopped anywhere besides gas stations? I followed their flashlight beams to my car's roof. In the harsh artificial light, I could see smudges there. Handprints, or what looked like handprints, pale against the Corolla's dark blue paint. But they were wrong somehow. The fingers too long, the palms too narrow, positioned as if someone had been lying flat on the roof, spread-eagled. The marks seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating small pockets of deeper darkness against the metal. The officers exchanged a glance that communicated something I wasn't meant to understand. The younger one stepped back, his hand moving closer to his service weapon, though he didn't draw it. The first officer told me, in a voice trying hard to sound routine, that they'd noticed someone sitting on top of my vehicle when I'd pulled up to the checkpoint. A woman, he said, dressed entirely in white. She'd been there one moment, he insisted, then simply wasn't. He used the word slid, said she'd slid off the roof and disappeared into the fog before they could react. I stood there tasting copper in my mouth, feeling my heartbeat in my temples. I told them, truthfully, that I'd seen no one, that I'd been alone, that I'd felt nothing on the roof. No weight, no movement, nothing that would indicate a passenger of any kind. The car's handling had been normal. Everything had been normal. The second officer asked with genuine curiosity edging toward concern if I'd noticed anything unusual during my drive. Any strange sensations, sounds, visions. The way he phrased it made me feel like I was being evaluated for something beyond sobriety, like they were trying to determine if I was sane. I almost didn't mention it. Almost drove away with just a shake of my head and a forced laugh about fog playing tricks on tired eyes. But something made me speak. Maybe the way they were both watching me, waiting, as if they expected me to confirm something they'd already decided was true. I told them about the bird. It had appeared on a back road about 40 miles ago, caught in my headlights for just an instant. A crow, or something similar, but wrong. It had been flying upside down, not tumbling, not falling, but flying with apparent purpose and control, its wings beating in perfect rhythm against the night sky, its body inverted as if gravity had reversed itself for this one creature. I'd only glimpsed it for a second before it vanished above my car, but the image had burned itself into my vision like a photographic negative. I dismissed it as an optical illusion, a trick of exhausted perception and poor lighting. The officers went very still. The first one told me, in that same carefully neutral voice, that I should probably stop for coffee. Find a well-lit place, maybe a truck stop, somewhere with other people. Shake off whatever was following me, he said. Shake off the spirits. He actually used that word, spirits. They let me go, told me to drive carefully, to stay alert. The younger officer walked back to my car with me, his flashlight still trained on the roof. The prints were fading, he said, as if trying to convince himself. Just condensation, probably. Happens all the time. His voice carried no conviction whatsoever. I got back in the Corolla, started the engine, and pulled away from the checkpoint slowly, watching it recede in my rearview mirror until the fog swallowed it completely. My hands shook now, trembling against the steering wheel. The heating vents whispered warm air across my face, but I felt cold, deeply cold, in a way that had nothing to do with October temperatures. The GPS showed a truck stop 6 miles ahead. I drove toward it, keeping my speed exactly at the limit, my eyes fixed rigidly forward. I would not look at the rearview mirror. I would not think about the upside-down bird or the marks on my roof or the woman the officers claimed to have seen. I would get coffee, wait for dawn and fluorescent lighting surrounded by truckers and travelers, then finish the last 2 hours of my journey home under the safety of daylight. That's when I heard it, a soft sound from directly above me, like fingernails dragging across metal. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Slow and deliberate. I told myself it was a branch. I'd driven under trees. Something had gotten caught in the roof rack I didn't have. The wind was creating friction against some imperfection in the paint. Any explanation except the one that was forming in my mind like ice crystals on glass. The sound stopped, started again, stopped. My headlights carved a tunnel through the fog. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. No other vehicles, no lights from houses, Nothing but darkness pressing in from all sides. The GPS showed 4 miles to the truck stop. 4 miles felt infinite. A pale shape flickered at the edge of my peripheral vision. There, then not there. Impossibly quick. I forced myself not to turn my head. The rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness. The side mirrors showed only fog and road, but I could feel it now. That presence. Stronger than before. Not just near me, but above me. Separated from my head by only the thin metal of the car's roof. 3 miles to the truck stop. The scratching sound returned, and this time it traced a pattern. Long strokes from front to back, as if someone were testing the surface, learning its dimensions. I accelerated slightly, then immediately regretted it. What if speed made it angry? What if... I stopped myself. This was insane. I was having a breakdown, clearly. Too many hours driving, too much coffee, not enough sleep. The mind creates patterns from chaos, sees meaning in randomness. The officers had been joking or confused, or I'd misheard them. There was no woman on my roof. There never had been. But the prints. I'd seen the prints. 2 miles to the truck stop. The scratching intensified, became rhythmic, almost like knocking. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, knock. A familiar pattern, though I couldn't place it. Something from childhood, maybe. Some game or rhyme long forgotten. The sound seemed to be moving now, traveling across the roof from passenger side to driver's side and back again, as if pacing. I reached for the radio, desperate for any sound to fill the silence between the knocks. My fingers found the dial, twisted it. Static erupted from the speakers, harsh and sudden, making me flinch. I cycled through stations, more static, fragments of late-night talk radio, a burst of country music, before settling on a news broadcast. The anchor's voice was steady, professional, describing weather patterns and traffic conditions. Normal things, safe things. The broadcast cut out mid-sentence. In the sudden silence, I heard breathing. Not my breathing. That was fast and shallow, audible even over the engine's hum. This was different. Slower, deeper. Coming from somewhere inside the car, though I was alone. I checked the back seat in the rearview mirror, knowing it was empty, needing to confirm it anyway. Nothing but shadows and the faint gleam of streetlight on leather. The breathing continued. In, out, with unsettling regularity. 1 mile to the truck stop. I could see lights ahead now, bright and artificial, promising salvation through sheer ordinariness. The truck stop materialized from the fog like a shrine. Multiple pumps, a convenience store attached to a diner, 18-wheelers parked in organized rows, their running lights creating constellations of red and amber. People were there, other human beings existing in the same reality I occupied. I just needed to reach them. Half a mile. The temperature inside the car dropped suddenly, dramatically. My breath became visible in the dashboard lights, small clouds forming with each exhalation. Frost began to spread across the inside of the windshield in intricate patterns. Not random, but deliberate, geometric, like someone was drawing with an invisible finger. The patterns looked like symbols, though I didn't recognize them. Ancient alphabets, maybe, or something that had never been language at all. The breathing above me grew louder, more insistent. The roof itself seemed to flex inward slightly, as if under pressure from tremendous weight. I heard fabric rustling, though I saw nothing. Smelled that sweet flower water scent again, now mixed with something else. Earth, maybe, or decay, or both. 1/4 mile. My vision began to blur around the edges. The truck stop's lights seemed to pulse and waver, becoming less solid, less real. I blinked hard, trying to clear my sight. And in that fraction of a second of darkness, I saw her. She was in the back seat. Or she wasn't. I couldn't tell. The rearview mirror showed her perfectly clear, sitting directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt her breath on my neck. She wore white, though the fabric looked wrong, more like burial shroud than clothing. Her face was pale to the point of translucence, her features beautiful but strange, proportions slightly off in ways I couldn't articulate. Her eyes met mine in the mirror, and they were black, completely black. like holes punched through reality. I jerked my head around to look directly at the back seat. Empty. Completely empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was still there, smiling now. Her mouth opened, and I heard that breathing sound again. Realized it had been her all along. She raised one hand, those two long fingers, that narrow palm, and pressed it against the inside of the rear window. The glass frosted immediately around her touch, creating another handprint identical to the ones on the roof. I was screaming. I realized this distantly, as if the sound was coming from someone else. My foot pressed the accelerator to the floor. The Corolla surged forward, eating up the final distance to the truck stop in seconds. I jerked the wheel hard, pulling into the parking lot with enough speed to make the tires squeal. I slammed on the brakes near the convenience store entrance, threw the transmission into park, and burst out of the vehicle like it was on fire. The night air hit me like a slap. I stood there, gasping, hands on my knees, trying to remember how to breathe normally. Behind me, the Corolla sat innocently under the fluorescent lights, looking exactly like what it was, a 3-year-old sedan with minor paint scratches and a parking permit sticker on the rear window. Slowly, dreading what I'd find, I straightened and walked around to the passenger side. From this angle, I could see the roof clearly. The surface was clean, no handprints, no marks, nothing but accumulated road dust and a few dried leaves. I ran my hand across it. Cold metal, completely normal. I checked the back seat through the window. Empty. The frost on the glass had melted or never existed. Everything looked exactly as it should. A trucker emerged from the convenience store carrying coffee and a bag of chips. He nodded at me in that universal acknowledgement of fellow travelers. I nodded back, my mouth dry. He climbed into his rig and pulled away, his exhaust creating brief clouds in the cold air. I walked into the store, my legs unsteady. The clerk barely looked up from her phone. Just another exhausted driver stopping for caffeine and overpriced snacks. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, steady and reliable. A radio played soft rock from the 1980s. A coffee machine gurgled contentedly. Everything was aggressively, beautifully normal. I poured the largest coffee they had, added enough cream to make it barely coffee-colored, and stood at the counter trying to convince my hands to stop shaking. The clerk finally noticed my state, asked if I was okay. I told her I was just tired, long drive, pushed myself too hard. She nodded knowingly and suggested I rest here for a while, maybe grab a booth in the attached diner. I paid, walked to my car to get my phone from the center console. The Corolla still looked completely ordinary. No mysterious women, no supernatural manifestations, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. I opened the driver's side door and leaned in to retrieve my phone. That's when I smelled it. That sweet flower water scent, stronger now, unmistakable. It permeated the interior, cloying and thick. And on the passenger seat, where nothing had been before, sat a single white feather. Not from a crow, too large, too pristine. It looked almost like a swan's feather, but longer, the quill stained with something dark. I stood there, frozen, the coffee burning my hand through the cheap cup. Behind me, the truck stop hummed with mundane activity. Engines starting, doors slamming, people moving through their ordinary lives. And in front of me, in my car, sat impossible proof of something I couldn't explain. The phone rang, still in the center console. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize. All zeros, just a string of them, which shouldn't be possible. I watched it ring once, twice, 3 times. My hand reached for it without my permission, lifted it to my ear, pressed the answer button. Static. Then, through the white noise, that breathing sound again. In, out, in, out. And then words, whispered in a voice that might have been beautiful once, that might still be beautiful if beauty could exist in wrong angles and impossible spaces. I'm still here. I was always here. You just weren't listening. The call ended. The phone's screen went dark. I looked up at my car's roof from inside the vehicle. In the dome light's glow, I could see them now. Those handprints, faint but visible, pressed against the interior ceiling fabric as if someone was lying on the roof and pushing down. As I watched, they shifted slightly, the fingers flexing, the palms repositioning. The breathing sound returned, coming from everywhere and nowhere, from the back seat and the trunk and the vents and the roof and inside my own chest. I'm writing this now, sitting in a booth at the truck stop diner, watching my Corolla through the window. It's been 3 hours. Dawn is still an hour away. The waitress has refilled my coffee 4 times and started giving me concerned looks. My phone won't turn on, though the battery was full. The feather is in my pocket, solid and undeniable. I should just abandon the car, call a taxi, get home some other way. But I know with absolute certainty that it wouldn't matter. Distance won't help. She's not in the car. She's attached to me now somehow, through means I don't understand and can't escape. The officers said to shake off the spirits. But what if you can't? What if the spirit decides it's found something it wants to keep? I keep thinking about that bird, flying upside down with perfect control. Keep thinking about how the world looks when you invert it. How down becomes up, how wrong becomes right, how impossible becomes inevitable. In the window's reflection, I can see the booth behind me, and in that booth, there's a woman in white, sitting perfectly still, watching me with eyes that are holes into nothing. When I turn around, of course, there's no one there. There never is. But I can feel her breathing on the back of my neck, and somewhere above me, on a roof I'm no longer beneath, I can still hear the scratching. Slow and patient and endless. Knock, knock, knock. Dawn is coming. But I don't think daylight is going to help anymore. I don't think anything is. Story 9. The heating system had been making noises all week, but this sound was different. I was in the living room, halfway through an article I wasn't really reading when I first noticed it. A wet, labored breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The kind of sound that makes your spine straighten involuntarily, that triggers some primal awareness buried deep in your brainstem. My brother Theo looked up from his laptop across the room, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. We locked eyes. The unspoken question hung between us like smoke. The breathing continued. In, out, in, out. Each inhalation rattled with fluid, each exhalation carrying a faint wheeze that set my teeth on edge. I could feel my pulse accelerating, that familiar pressure building behind my eyes that came with the onset of anxiety. But Theo heard it too. I could see it in the way his shoulders had tensed, the way his gaze darted toward the hallway. Our Aunt Helen had been dying for 6 months. Cancer, aggressive and merciless, eating through her lungs like rust through metal. We'd visited her 3 weeks ago at hospice. The sound of her breathing then had haunted my dreams ever since. That same wet, struggling quality, as if she were drowning in her own body. But she was 20 miles away. I forced myself to stand, the magazine sliding forgotten to the floor. The breathing didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I moved toward the hallway, each step deliberate, fighting against every instinct screaming at me to remain still, to not investigate, to pretend I heard nothing. Theo rose too, following a few paces behind. Neither of us spoke. Speaking would make it real, would acknowledge that something impossible was happening in our ordinary suburban home on this ordinary Tuesday night. The hallway stretched before us, familiar and suddenly alien. The breathing seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the space between the plaster and paint, from the shadows pooling in the corners, where the overhead light couldn't quite reach. My hand found the wall, needing the tactile confirmation of something solid, something real. The temperature had dropped. I could see my breath now, thin wisps of vapor in the air. The thermostat read 72 degrees, but my skin prickled with goosebumps, and I could feel the cold seeping through my shirt, into my bones. In, out, in, out. The breathing followed us as we checked each room. The guest bedroom, empty and still. The bathroom, where the mirror had fogged over despite the cold, condensation running down the glass in slow rivulets. The kitchen, where the digital clock on the microwave blinked 11:47 p.m. in accusing red numbers. We found nothing. No source, no explanation. Just that persistent, horrible breathing that made my chest tighten in sympathy. Theo finally broke our silence, his voice barely above a whisper. He suggested it was the pipes, the HVAC system, something mechanical and mundane. The rationalization sounded hollow even as he spoke it. I nodded anyway, clinging to the explanation like a lifeline, though we both knew the heating system didn't sound like lungs fighting for air. We returned to the living room, but the atmosphere had changed. The space felt smaller now, the walls closer. The breathing continued its rhythm, sometimes louder, sometimes fading to barely audible, but never stopping completely. It had become the baseline of our reality, the soundtrack to our mounting unease. I tried to return to my article, but the words swam meaninglessly across the page. My ears were tuned to that other frequency now, tracking each inhalation and exhalation, waiting for it to stop, dreading what might happen when it did. Theo's phone rang at 11:52 p.m. The sudden electronic trill cut through the breathing, and for one bizarre moment, both sounds existed simultaneously. The ragged gasps and the cheerful ringtone creating a dissonant symphony. He answered, and I watched his face transform. The color drained from his cheeks. His free hand gripped the arm of his chair until his knuckles went white. When he lowered the phone, his eyes found mine, and I already knew. Aunt Helen had passed. 11:47. The exact time we'd noticed the breathing. The exact time I'd checked in the kitchen. The room tilted slightly, reality bending at the edges. Coincidence, I told myself. Just coincidence. People die every minute. Timing means nothing. But my rational mind couldn't quite drown out that other voice, the one that had been whispering since we first heard that impossible sound. The breathing had stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and expectant. I became hyper-aware of every small sound, the creak of the house settling, the distant hum of the refrigerator, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Theo was saying something about calling our parents, about arrangements, about things that needed to be done. His words seemed to come from very far away. I nodded mechanically, but my attention was elsewhere, focused on the quality of the silence, the weight of it. That's when I felt it. A presence. There's no other word for it. That animal awareness of being watched, of sharing space with something unseen. The air behind my right shoulder felt heavier, denser. I didn't turn around. Couldn't turn around. Some deep survival instinct warned me that looking directly at whatever was there would be a mistake I couldn't undo. The temperature dropped further. I could see frost forming on the window, delicate crystalline patterns spreading across the glass like reaching fingers. My breath came out in thick clouds now. Theo saw it too, his monologue about funeral arrangements trailing off mid-sentence. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a shadow where no shadow should be, darker than the surrounding darkness, with depth and substance. It stood near the hallway entrance, in the same spot where the breathing had seemed strongest. I forced myself to turn my head slowly, incrementally, fighting every screaming nerve. The shadow rippled at the edge of my vision, always just beyond the point where I could focus on it directly. When I tried to look at it straight on, it dissipated like smoke, only to reform when I looked away. Theo saw it. I knew because he'd stopped talking entirely, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. We sat frozen, two grown men paralyzed by something our eyes couldn't quite perceive but our hindbrain recognized as a threat. The shadow moved. Not walked, not drifted. Moved, in a way that defied natural physics. It was closer now, though I hadn't seen it cross the intervening space. The air grew colder still. My fingers were going numb. A sound emerged from the shadow. Not breathing this time, but something worse. A voice, if you could call it that. Formless words that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. Syllables that tasted of copper and felt like ice water down my spine. I couldn't make out what it was trying to say, but I felt its urgency, its need to communicate something vital. My phone buzzed. A text from our mother. The hospice had called her too. They'd mentioned something strange. Aunt Helen's last moments had been unusual. She'd suddenly sat up, looked toward the door of her room with clear, focused eyes that had been glazed and unseeing for days. The nurse said she'd seemed to be looking at something beyond the doorway, something in the hallway. She'd tried to speak, but her voice was gone. Instead, she'd simply breathed, in and out, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. Then she was gone. I showed Theo the text. His face had gone gray. We both understood what we didn't want to understand. Aunt Helen had been trying to reach us, or had reached us, or something had used her last moments to bridge the impossible distance between her dying body and our home. The shadow was still there, still watching. I could feel its attention like a physical weight. My thoughts raced through impossible explanations and rational dismissals, each canceling out the other until I was left with nothing but confusion and fear. Was she trying to say goodbye? Was she warning us of something? Or had our grief and guilt over not being there at her bedside somehow manifested this delusion? This shared hallucination born from the stress of watching someone we loved slowly suffocate over 6 months. The shadow moved again, closer still. I could see my breath hanging in the air between us, suspended like frozen time. Theo's hand found my arm, gripping tight enough to hurt. The presence felt massive now, filling the room, pressing down on us with the weight of something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The lights flickered, once, twice. The shadow seemed to pulse with each fluctuation, growing more substantial, more real. I could almost see features now, the suggestion of a form, the outline of something that might have been human once. Then I heard it again, that breathing, softer now but unmistakable, in and out, in and out. The same labored rhythm that had started this whole nightmare. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, a whisper, barely audible, that might have been my name, or might have been just the wind through some gap in the house's structure. The temperature began to normalize. Slowly, degree by degree, the oppressive cold lifted. The shadow started to fade, growing less distinct, less present. The breathing grew fainter, each cycle softer than the last, until it was nothing more than a memory of a sound, an echo that might have never existed. By 12:30 a.m., the house felt normal again. The thermostat read 72 degrees. The windows were clear. The shadows fell in their usual patterns, obeying the natural laws of light and geometry. Theo and I sat in silence for a long time after. What was there to say? That our dying aunt had somehow projected her consciousness across 20 miles to visit us one last time? That we'd experienced some mass delusion brought on by stress and grief? That our house was haunted? That we were losing our minds? None of the explanations satisfied. None of them made sense. We called our parents, made arrangements, did all the things the living must do when death visits a family. We attended the funeral. We sorted through her belongings. Life moved forward because life always does, regardless of the impossibilities we encounter along the way. But I still feel it sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet. That presence, that awareness of being watched. The temperature drops for no reason. Shadows fall in ways they shouldn't. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear it again. That breathing, in and out, in and out. I tell myself it's the pipes, the heating system, my imagination playing tricks in the liminal space between waking and sleep. I tell myself anything but the truth I can't quite accept and can't quite deny. Because here's what I can't explain, what keeps me awake in those dark hours before dawn. After that night, I found something in my pocket. A tissue, neatly folded, the kind Aunt Helen always carried, scented with the lavender perfume she'd worn for 40 years. I hadn't been to her house in 3 weeks. I'd changed clothes a dozen times since then. That tissue shouldn't have been there, but it was. And sometimes, late at night, I take it out and hold it. The lavender scent has faded now, nearly gone. But I swear, when I hold it close, I can still hear it. That breathing, her breathing. Or maybe it's just the sound of my own breath, loud in the midnight silence. as I lie awake wondering if she's still trying to reach me, still trying to tell me something I'm too frightened or too rational or too broken to understand. I don't know which possibility terrifies me more, that it was real or that it wasn't. The breathing continues, in my head, in the walls, in the space between what I know and what I fear. And I listen, always listening, waiting for the moment when the breath will finally truly stop, or when I'll understand what it's trying to say. Story 10. The handprints are still there. I know because I checked again this morning, 3 weeks after leaving that godforsaken rim campsite in northern Arizona. I drove my sedan to the grocery store parking lot, circled around to the passenger side, and there they were, 5 elongated smudges on the window, each fingertip ending in what could only be described as claw marks. The glass cleaner I'd used twice hadn't touched them. Neither had the professional detailing I'd paid for last Tuesday. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The campsite was my idea, a monumentally stupid decision born from the kind of restlessness that accumulates in a man's chest after too many identical days. My colleague at the surveying firm had mentioned the spot, a primitive site along the Mogollon Rim, accessible only by a washboard Forest Service road that tested the limits of any vehicle not built for punishment. No other campers for miles. No cell service, no light pollution, just red rock, ponderosa pines, and a view that stretched across canyons so deep they seemed to inhale the sunlight. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday in late August, when the heat still pressed against the landscape like a hand on fevered skin. The site itself was nothing more than a clearing ringed by junipers, with a fire pit made from stacked stones and a weathered picnic table listing to one side. The rim dropped away 30 feet from where I parked, a sheer cliff face descending into shadow. The silence struck me first. Not the peaceful quiet of solitude, but an active, almost aggressive absence of sound. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it moved through the pine needles. I told myself it was just the altitude, 7,000 feet, making my ears feel stuffed with cotton. I set up my tent as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the distant buttes in shades of rust and purple. The temperature dropped fast once the light failed, that desert phenomenon that always catches lowlanders by surprise. I built a small fire and ate a cold sandwich, watching sparks spiral up into the crystalline darkness above. That's when I first felt it, the sensation of being observed. It wasn't anything I could point to, no snapped twig or reflected eyeshine in the firelight, just a pressure against my back, a weight of attention that made the skin between my shoulder blades crawl. I turned several times, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, illuminating nothing but gnarled bark and the occasional boulder. The beam seemed to die quickly in that darkness, swallowed by something thicker than mere absence of light. I convinced myself it was just isolation playing tricks, the mind's tendency to populate emptiness with threat. I'd read about it, how humans are wired to detect faces and figures in random patterns, an evolutionary holdover from when things with teeth actually hunted us. I banked the fire and retreated to my tent, zipping the flap with more force than necessary. Sleep came in fragments. I'd drift off, then jolt awake with my heart hammering, certain I'd heard footsteps circling the tent. But when I held my breath and listened, there was only that suffocating silence. Once, around what must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, I could have sworn I heard breathing just outside the thin nylon wall. Long, slow inhalations that seemed to draw in far too much air. I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle locked, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness, the darkness bleeding to gray with a reluctance that felt almost deliberate. I emerged from the tent exhausted, my nerves scraped raw by a night of vigilance. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it, fire pit cold, no tracks in the dust. I almost laughed at myself then, at how thoroughly I'd let paranoia colonize my thoughts. I decided to leave after breakfast. The isolation had lost its appeal, replaced by something that felt too much like dread. I packed quickly, barely pausing to eat the granola bar I'd pulled from my supplies. The morning air was crisp, almost cold, and carried a smell I couldn't quite place, something organic and slightly sweet, like overripe fruit starting to turn. I was loading the last of my gear into the trunk when I heard it. A sound like fingernails on fabric, slow, deliberate, coming from the other side of the car. I froze, one hand still gripping my camp chair. The sound continued, a soft scraping that seemed to move along the passenger side of the vehicle. I couldn't see over the roof from where I stood, and for several heartbeats, I couldn't force myself to move. The sound stopped, started again, stopped. Then came the breathing. It was the same sound from the night before, those deep, rattling inhalations, but closer now. So close I could hear the wheeze at the end of each breath, like something was caught in a damaged throat. My own breathing had gone shallow and quick, barely pulling in enough oxygen to keep the gray edges from closing in on my vision. I don't remember making the decision to look. My body simply moved, carrying me around the front of the car with legs that felt disconnected from conscious thought. When I rounded the hood, I saw them, the hands. They were pressed against the passenger window, fingers splayed wide. But these weren't normal hands. The nails, if you could call them that, extended at least 2 inches past the fingertips, yellowed and ridged like horn, crusted with what might have been dirt or something worse. The fingers themselves were wrong too long and somehow jointed in places that didn't match human anatomy. The skin was a grayish color, almost translucent, with dark shapes visible beneath that could have been veins or something else entirely. As I watched, frozen in a terror so complete it felt like physical paralysis, fog began to bloom against the glass. Hot breath. Someone, something, was breathing against my car window, close enough that condensation spread in an expanding circle around those nightmare hands. I ran. There's no dignity in admitting it, but there it is. I ran back to the driver's side, yanked open the door, threw myself inside, and locked everything with shaking hands. The engine turned over on the second try. A small mercy I've thanked whatever gods might listen for every day since. I didn't look at the passenger window. Couldn't. I just reversed in a spray of dust and stones, nearly backing into a pine tree before I managed to get the car pointed toward the Forest Service road. I drove that washboard road at speeds that should have destroyed my suspension, skidding around corners, bottoming out in ruts deep enough to swallow a tire. I kept my eyes locked on the path ahead, refusing to glance at the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see standing in the dust cloud behind me. It wasn't until I reached the paved highway, 15 miles of brutal driving later, that I finally looked at the passenger window. The handprints were there, 5 distinct marks, each finger clearly defined, those grotesque nails having scored fine lines in the safety glass. And in the center, where the breath had fogged the window, someone had drawn a symbol. Or maybe it had always been there, revealed by the condensation, a spiral that seemed to pull the eye inward, down into its center where the lines became too small to follow. I should have called the police. Should have reported something. Trespassing, vandalism, anything. But what would I have said? That something with hands like a corpse had touched my car at a campsite where I was completely alone? That I'd felt watched by an intelligence I couldn't see or define? They would have asked reasonable questions I had no reasonable answers for. So I drove home, trying to convince myself it had been a person. A homeless individual, maybe, living rough in the national forest. Someone whose nails had grown long and whose hygiene had suffered. Someone who'd seen my car and approached for reasons I didn't need to understand. The alternative was too destabilizing to consider. But then the dream started. Not nightmares exactly, just images. I'm back at the Rim campsite, standing at the edge of the cliff, looking down into the canyon. And something is looking back up at me. I can't make out details. The distance is too great, the shadows too deep. But I can feel its attention like a physical touch. And I know, with the certainty that only exists in dreams, that it's been waiting there a very long time. That it's still waiting. I wake from these dreams to find myself standing at my bedroom window, hands pressed against the glass, staring out at the suburban street below. The first time it happened, my girlfriend at the time nearly called an ambulance. She told me I'd been sleepwalking, that she'd found me there at 3 in the morning, breathing against the window until condensation obscured everything outside. We broke up 2 weeks later. She said I'd changed, that she couldn't sleep in the same room as me anymore because I watched her. I tried to argue, but I'd started to wonder myself. Had I been watching her? I couldn't remember. The handprints haven't faded. If anything, they've become more distinct. The scratches in the glass deeper than they should be. I've taken photographs, but something about the angle or the light always makes them look like ordinary smudges in the images. Nothing that would convince anyone else. Last week I noticed something new. Fingerprints on the inside of the window, pressed against the glass from within the car. My fingerprints, I assumed, though I couldn't remember touching that particular spot. But when I looked closer, I saw they were too large to be mine. The fingers too long. The nails leaving those same telltale scratches. I've started keeping the car locked at all times, even when it's parked in my garage. Especially when it's in my garage. Because twice now I've woken in the middle of the night, absolutely certain I heard that breathing sound coming from below my apartment. That deep, rattling inhalation that seems to pull in all the air in the room. My coworker asked me yesterday if I'd recommend the campsite. He's thinking about taking his girlfriend up there, wants to know if the views are worth the drive. I told him the road was too rough, that my car barely made it. I didn't mention the hands or the marks or the dreams. I didn't tell him about the photographs I found on my phone, taken at angles I don't remember shooting, showing my empty apartment at night with something blurred in the peripheral vision of each frame. I've been researching the area, trying to find some explanation. The Rim has history, ancient pueblos, abandonment stories, rumors of things seen in the deep canyons. But nothing specific, nothing that helps. The worst part isn't the fear, though. It's the doubt. Because sometimes, when I catch my reflection in that passenger window with its stubborn handprints, I see something that makes my breath catch. My nails look longer than they should. Not dramatically so, just a few millimeters beyond where I remember them being. And when I hold my hands up to compare them to the prints on the glass, they're not quite the same size, but they're closer than they used to be. I've thought about selling the car, but I can't shake the feeling that it wouldn't matter. That whatever marked that glass has already marked something else, something more permanent. Tonight I stood at my bathroom mirror for 20 minutes, trimming my nails as short as they would go until the clippers bit into the quick and drew blood. My hands are shaking now as I write this, not from pain but from the realization that hit me as I cleaned up the clippings. There were too many, far too many pieces for 10 fingers. I need to count them again, need to be sure. But I'm afraid to go back into that bathroom, afraid of what I'll see in the mirror, afraid of whose reflection will stare back with eyes that have started to look just a little bit wrong, a little bit too aware of something I'm only beginning to understand. The handprints are still there. I know because I checked again this morning, but this time, I couldn't remember which side of the glass I was on. Story 11. The house breathed differently when empty. I noticed it first around 3 in the afternoon, after Mom left for her conference, and Dad texted that his flight was delayed another 4 hours. The air felt thicker somehow, pressing against my eardrums with each step I took through the hallway. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, echoing through rooms that suddenly felt cavernous despite their familiar dimensions. I was 17, old enough that being alone shouldn't have mattered. Yet something about the quality of silence that afternoon felt wrong, like the pause between a question and an unwanted answer. Mr. Holloway had been dead for 3 weeks. The thought arrived unbidden as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the staircase visible through the doorway. Our neighbor for 12 years, the old man who'd always waved from his porch with that distinctive 2-fingered salute, the one who'd taught me to identify bird calls when I was younger. Heart attack, they said. Found him in his armchair, newspaper still folded neatly on his lap, reading glasses perched on his nose, as if he'd simply decided to stop mid-sentence and never resume. His house stood dark now, just across the narrow strip of grass that separated our properties. I could see it through the kitchen window, Windows like empty eye sockets, the for sale sign already staked in the front yard. The real estate agent had been there yesterday, her high heels clicking on his walkway like small bones breaking. I made myself a sandwich I didn't want and carried it upstairs, each step creaking under my weight. The afternoon light slanted through the window at the landing, casting long shadows that stretched down toward the first floor. Dust motes drifted lazily through the golden beams, and for a moment I stood there watching them, hypnotized by their aimless dance. That's when I first felt it, the sensation of being observed. It started at the base of my spine, a cold trickle of awareness that spread upward, vertebra by vertebra, until the skin on the back of my neck prickled with goosebumps. I turned slowly, scanning the empty hallway behind me. Nothing, just the familiar wallpaper with its faded floral pattern, the closed doors of bedrooms, the bathroom at the end of the hall with its door slightly ajar. I shook it off and continued to my room, but the feeling clung to me like cobwebs. By 6 o'clock, the sun had started its descent, painting the walls in shades of amber and rust. I'd been trying to focus on homework, but my attention kept drifting to the window, to Mr. Holloway's darkened house, to the growing shadows that pooled in the corners of my room. The emptiness of the house seemed to expand with the approaching dusk, filling spaces I'd never noticed before. I needed water. My mouth felt dry, tongue thick and heavy. The hallway stretched before me longer than I remembered. The light from my room behind me only reached so far, leaving the staircase shrouded in premature twilight. I could hear the house settling around me, the tick of cooling pipes, the whisper of air through vents, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Normal sounds that tonight felt like a coded language I couldn't quite decipher. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped. Something dark stood on the landing below. Not darkness itself, though the shadows had thickened considerably, but a figure, a silhouette against the dimming light from the living room window. Tall, slightly stooped, with shoulders that curved forward in a posture I recognized instantly. My breath caught in my throat. My hand found the banister, gripping it hard enough that my knuckles went white. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, facing upward, as if looking directly at me, though I could discern no features in the darkness of its face. The longer I stared, the more details my eyes seemed to find, or create. The suggestion of a cardigan, the hint of pale hands clasped loosely at the waist, the familiar tilt of a head I'd seen 1,000 times in conversation. I should have been terrified. Every rational instinct should have sent me scrambling backward, fumbling for my phone, locking myself in my room. But instead, something strange happened. The fear that had been building in my chest since the afternoon began to ease, replaced by an unexpected sense of calm. Recognition, perhaps. Or something deeper, more primal. The way you might feel seeing a childhood home after years away, even if the memories associated with it were complicated. The shadow didn't approach. It didn't speak or gesture. It simply stood there on the landing, a dark sentinel between me and the first floor, and I found myself slowly descending toward it. Each step down felt like moving through water. The air grew colder as I approached, and I could see my breath now, small clouds of condensation forming with each exhale, but still, no fear. Only this strange, inexplicable comfort, as if something in my lizard brain recognized this presence as safe, familiar, protective even. I stopped 3 steps from the landing, close enough now that if the figure were solid, I could have reached out and touched it. Close enough to see that it wasn't a trick of shadows after all. There was substance here, a darkness more concentrated than the surrounding dimness, a shape with edges and depth. The figure raised one hand slowly, and I watched, transfixed, as it lifted 2 fingers in that familiar salute. The gesture was so precise, so perfectly mimicked, that something in my chest loosened. I felt my eyes grow hot with tears I didn't understand. Then gently, impossibly gently, I felt a pressure on my shoulder. Not a hand exactly, but the memory of a hand. The ghost of reassurance. The echo of someone saying without words that everything would be all right, that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching over this empty house with its empty rooms. My eyelids grew heavy. The exhaustion I'd been fighting all day crashed over me like a wave, and I sank down onto the step, my back against the wall. The last thing I remembered was the figure still standing there on the landing, that raised hand slowly lowering, and the strange sense that I was safer here, on these stairs, than I'd been anywhere else all day. I woke to the sound of the front door opening. For a moment I was disoriented, my neck stiff from the awkward angle, my left leg tingling with sleep. Pale morning light filtered through the windows, and I blinked, trying to remember why I was sitting on the staircase. Then it came rushing back, the shadow, the figure, the inexplicable comfort. The landing below was empty now, just ordinary space filled with ordinary morning light. Mom's footsteps echoed in the entryway, followed by Dad's heavier tread. I heard them stop, their voices low and urgent in conversation, though I couldn't make out the words. Then Mom's voice rose slightly, calling my name with a note of concern that brought me fully awake. I descended the rest of the stairs, my joints protesting, to find both of them standing in the living room still wearing their travel clothes, their faces pale and drawn. Mom reached me first, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes searching my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She asked if I was all right, if anything had happened while they were gone, if I'd slept well. The questions tumbled out rapidly, and I assured her I was fine, just fell asleep studying. But something in her expression told me she didn't believe me, or perhaps that she was afraid to believe me. Dad stood by the window, staring out at Mr. Holloway's house with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes held a question he seemed afraid to ask. Mom guided me to the couch, sat beside me, took my hand in hers. Her palms were cold and slightly damp. She spoke carefully, choosing each word as if navigating a minefield, explaining that they'd both come home early, that Dad had caught an earlier flight, that her conference had been cut short. She paused, exchanged a glance with Dad, then asked me the question that made my blood run cold. Had I seen anything unusual? Anything strange in the house? I could have lied, should have lied, but something made me tell the truth, or part of it. I mentioned seeing a shadow on the stairs, a figure that stood on the landing. I didn't mention the comfort I'd felt, the sense of protection, the way I'd fallen asleep practically in its presence. Those details felt private, sacred somehow, like sharing them would violate something I didn't fully understand. Mom's grip on my hand tightened painfully. Dad crossed the room and sat in the armchair, his face ashen. They looked at each other again, that long, significant look that passes between people who share a terrible secret. Dad spoke then, his voice rough as if he'd been shouting, though I knew he hadn't. He told me that last night, while driving home from the airport around 2 a.m, he'd stopped at a red light 3 blocks from our house. While waiting for the light to change, he'd happened to glance toward our street and seen something in our front window, the living room window. A figure, standing perfectly still, looking out. His first thought was that I was awake, standing there looking for headlights. But as he got closer, turning onto our street, he realized the figure was too tall to be me, too stooped. And it was standing in a way no living person stood, perfectly motionless. Not even the slight sway of breathing, just absolute stillness. As he'd pulled into the driveway, the figure had turned from the window and moved deeper into the house. Not walked, moved, glided, disappeared into the interior darkness. By the time he'd gotten inside, fumbling with his keys, heart hammering, there was nothing. Just an empty house, me asleep upstairs. Everything normal except for the cold that seemed to emanate from the living room. Mom's story was similar, but worse. She'd returned around 4 a.m, her conference having ended abruptly with some unspecified emergency. As she'd approached the house, she'd seen a figure standing on our front porch. At first, she'd thought someone was trying to break in and had nearly called the police. But as she got closer, she'd recognized the silhouette, the stooped shoulders, the familiar posture, the way the figure held itself. Mr. Holloway. Except Mr. Holloway was dead, had been dead for 3 weeks, was currently resting in Riverside Cemetery under a modest granite headstone. She'd sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes. Engine running, hands shaking on the steering wheel, watching the figure. It never moved, never turned, just stood there facing the door as if waiting to be invited in. Eventually, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, it had simply faded, not walked away or disappeared suddenly, but gradually became less solid, less there, until the porch was empty again. The three of us sat in the morning light, the silence between us heavy with implications. I wanted to tell them about the comfort I'd felt, about the gentle pressure on my shoulder, about how the fear had drained away in the presence of that shadow. But looking at their terrified faces, I kept quiet. Dad suggested we leave for a few days, stay at a hotel or with relatives. Mom agreed immediately, already reaching for her phone to make arrangements. But something in me resisted. Some instinct I couldn't name whispered that leaving would be wrong, that the figure, whatever it was, meant no harm. I heard myself saying we should stay, that we were safe here. The words came out with a certainty I didn't consciously feel, and both my parents stared at me as if I'd suggested we invite the darkness in for dinner. But here's what I couldn't tell them, what I barely admitted to myself in the days that followed. I wanted to see it again. That shadow on the stairs had filled something in me I didn't know was empty. In that moment of supernatural dread, I'd felt less alone than I had in months, maybe years. The human mind is a strange landscape. We're told to fear death, to recoil from anything that reminds us of our mortality. But what if death isn't the terrible ending we imagine? What if it's just another room in an infinite house, and sometimes the door swings open, and someone we loved, or who loved us, looks through to make sure we're all right? Or maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe we all were. Some shared delusion brought on by grief and guilt, and the terrible weight of knowing that people we care about disappear without warning, leaving only empty houses and unanswered questions. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle, waiting. My parents were downstairs, their voices low and worried. I heard Dad on the phone with someone, a priest maybe, or a therapist. I heard Mom crying softly, the sound muffled as if she had her face pressed into a pillow. I stared at my bedroom door, left deliberately ajar, and watched the rectangle of hallway light with an intensity that made my eyes water. The shadows shifted and danced with each subtle change in the downstairs lighting. Normal shadows doing normal things. But once, just for a moment, I thought I saw it. That distinctive silhouette passing by my door, pausing for just a heartbeat before continuing down the hallway. And instead of fear, I felt that same inexplicable comfort wash over me, warm and safe as a blanket on a cold night. I never told my parents about that moment. I never told anyone. Because here's the truth I've come to understand in the weeks since. Reality is far more fragile than we pretend. The line between the living and the dead, between sanity and madness, between comfort and terror, it's thinner than paper, and sometimes it tears. Maybe Mr. Holloway stood on our stairs that night. Maybe we all saw him because we needed to, because grief does strange things to perception, because the human mind will create what it needs to survive. Or maybe he was really there, somehow, checking on the family he'd watched over for 12 years, making sure we were safe in his absence. I'll never know for certain. None of us will. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel that pressure on my shoulder. Gentle, reassuring, familiar. And I sleep better for it, even if I shouldn't. Even if it means I'm going mad. Even if it means we all are. Story 12. The smell hit us before we even reached the third floor. I'd been doing removal work for Lundgren & Sons for 8 years, and I thought I'd experienced every variation of death's aftermath. The suicides discovered weeks late. The elderly who passed in winter with their heating on full blast. The summer deaths in sealed apartments. But this was different. This was something that crawled into your sinuses and made a home there. Something that felt almost alive in its insistence. My partner, Oscar, stopped on the landing, his hand covering his mouth. Through the stairwell window, Stockholm stretched out in shades of gray and white, the November sky pressing down like a lid on a pot. Inside, the hallway was darker, narrower, the kind of old building where the walls seemed to lean inward. The landlord stood by the door, a thin man whose name I'd already forgotten. He wasn't meeting our eyes. The door had 3 separate padlocks, each one gleaming dully in the fluorescent light. Someone had wanted to keep this place sealed. When he finally opened the door, the smell became a physical presence. It wasn't just the odor of decomposition, that familiar sweet rot that every removal worker knows. This was layered, ancient, as if death itself had been fermenting in there, developing new and terrible dimensions. My eyes watered instantly. Oscar made a sound that might have been a gag or a curse. The apartment was dark except for thin strips of light that managed to penetrate the covered windows. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the shape of the rooms. A small kitchen to the left, a living area straight ahead, and beyond that, what must have been the bedroom. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and I could feel it coating the back of my throat with each breath. She was in the bedroom, or what remained of her was. I've never been particularly religious, but standing in that doorway, I found myself thinking about souls and whether they linger. The body on the bed was barely recognizable as human, more a dark stain on the mattress, a collapsed architecture of bones and leathery skin. But it was the movement that made my stomach turn. The entire surface seemed to writhe and pulse. Maggots, thousands of them, maybe hundreds of thousands, writhing in waves across the bedding, the floor, climbing the walls in searching patterns. The landlord spoke from somewhere behind us, his voice muffled through his shirt. He mentioned something about neighbors complaining about the smell for weeks, about how they'd finally gotten the police involved, about how she'd lived alone. No family, no visitors. The words barely registered. I was focused on the task ahead, on the procedures we'd need to follow, on keeping my breathing shallow and mechanical. We worked for hours in that apartment. The hazmat suits helped with the smell, but they couldn't block it entirely. Nothing could. It seeped through every barrier, every filter, until it became part of you. We sealed the worst of the remains, documented everything for the authorities, removed what needed removing. Standard procedure, except nothing about this felt standard. It was the eyes I kept noticing, or rather the absence of them. Where her eyes should have been, there were just dark hollows. But several times I could have sworn I caught movement in those shadows. Not maggots. Something else. Something that suggested she was watching us work, observing these strangers who had invaded her final privacy. Oscar noticed it too. He didn't say anything, but I caught him glancing toward the bedroom doorway more than once, even after we'd moved the remains. He'd stop mid-motion, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. By the time we finished, night had fallen. The apartment looked almost ordinary in the harsh work lights we'd set up, just another sad space where someone had lived and died alone. But the smell remained, clinging to everything, a presence that refused to be cleaned away. The funeral was 4 days later. I'd never attended a funeral for someone I'd removed before. There was usually no connection, no reason to follow the dead beyond our professional obligations. But something pulled me to that church on the outskirts of the city. Some compulsion I couldn't quite name. Maybe I wanted to see her properly laid to rest. Maybe I wanted confirmation that the job was truly finished. The church was old, one of those medieval stone structures that dot the Swedish countryside, with small windows and thick walls built to withstand centuries. There were perhaps 15 people in attendance, scattered across the pews like islands. The priest stood at the front, her face carefully composed. The sealed casket rested on its bier, simple and unadorned. And then about 10 minutes into the service, it started. At first I thought it was my imagination, some phantom memory my brain had conjured. But the woman in front of me shifted uncomfortably. Then the man across the aisle pulled out a handkerchief. The smell was seeping into the church, leaking from the sealed casket despite all the embalming, all the chemicals. all the attempts to contain it. Within minutes, it was undeniable. That same thick, layered rot I'd encountered in the apartment was filling the sacred space. People began to cough, to cover their faces. Someone near the back stood up and left quickly, their footsteps echoing off the stone. The priest's voice wavered but continued, pushing through the liturgy with determination. I sat there, frozen, breathing through my mouth in shallow sips. The smell was exactly as I remembered it, not diminished, not changed by time or treatment. If anything, it seemed stronger, more concentrated, and underneath it, or perhaps woven through it, there was something else. A suggestion of perfume, sickly sweet and floral, like someone had tried to mask death with flowers, and only succeeded in creating something worse. The service ended early. No one admitted it, but we all understood. The priest gave a final blessing, her words rushed, and people filed out into the clean winter air like drowning victims breaking the surface. I was one of the last to leave, and as I walked past the casket, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched, of empty eye sockets following my movement. That night, I couldn't escape the smell. I'd showered 3 times after the removal job, scrubbed my skin until it was raw, but the smell persisted. I chalked it up to memory, to psychological residue. But after the funeral, it was back with renewed intensity. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. When I breathed in, it was there. When I breathed out, it remained. I washed everything I owned. I threw away the clothes I'd worn to the funeral. I opened every window in my apartment despite the November cold. Nothing helped. The smell had taken residence in my sinuses, in my memory, in something deeper than either. Work became difficult. I'd be in the middle of a routine removal, an expected death, someone who'd been found quickly, nothing traumatic. And suddenly the smell would overwhelm me. Not the smell of the current job, but that smell, the one from her apartment, layered and complex and horribly alive. Oscar mentioned that he'd been experiencing something similar, though he wouldn't give details. He'd just say that the job was getting to him, that maybe we needed a break, but there was something in his eyes when he said it, a shadow of the same thing I was feeling. He stopped answering his phone after a while. When I went by his place, his girlfriend told me he'd taken some time off, gone to stay with family up north. She looked worried, but wouldn't elaborate. The dreams started around then. I'd find myself back in that apartment, but the layout was different. Rooms that hadn't been there before, hallways that stretched impossibly long. The maggots had grown larger, the size of fingers, and they moved with purpose, with intelligence. And always, there was the sense of her presence, watching from those hollow eyes, waiting for something. In one dream, I opened the bedroom door and she was sitting up in bed, her body impossibly intact despite the decay. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Or perhaps the sound was just pitched too low for me to hear, a vibration I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. When I woke, my apartment reeked of that smell, so strongly that I genuinely wondered if something had died in my walls. I started seeing her in peripheral vision, quick flashes that vanished when I turned to look directly. A figure in a window, a shadow in a doorway. The suggestion of someone standing just behind me, close enough that I should be able to feel their breath on my neck. The rational part of my mind knew this was trauma response, stress manifesting in hallucinations and olfactory memories. I'd read about it, how people in our line of work sometimes carry the dead with them, how certain jobs burrow into your psyche and refuse to leave. I even made an appointment with a therapist, sat in the waiting room, and couldn't bring myself to go through with it. How could I explain what I was experiencing? How could I describe the smell that no one else seemed to notice? Because that was the strangest part. When I finally worked up the courage to mention it to a colleague, carefully, obliquely, they looked at me with confusion. The job from 3 weeks ago, the one on Gutgarten, they barely remembered it. Just another removal, sad but routine. When I pressed about the funeral, about the smell that had driven people from the church, they had no idea what I was talking about. There hadn't been a funeral, they said. The body had been cremated directly, As was standard for cases with no family, I'd called the church. The priest didn't know what I was talking about. There had been no service that day, no burial, no casket leaking that terrible smell into consecrated air. This is when the fear truly set in, when the possibility emerged that I hadn't been experiencing trauma or stress, but something far worse. That my mind had constructed false memories, entire events that never happened, or that something had happened in that apartment. Something that had attached itself to me like those maggots had crawled across their host. Last night, I woke at 3 a.m. to find my apartment filled with that smell, so thick I could barely breathe. I stumbled to the window, threw it open, gasped in the winter air. The street below was empty, silent except for the distant sound of traffic. And then I saw her, standing on the sidewalk directly beneath my window, her face tilted up toward me. Even 3 stories up, in the dim sodium light of the street lamps, I could see those hollow eyes, those dark pits where eyes should have been, fixed on me with terrible intensity. She didn't move, didn't gesture, just stood there, watching, as the smell in my apartment grew stronger. I blinked, and she was gone. The street was empty. The smell remained. I'm writing this now because I need to document what's happening, to create some external record before I lose the ability to distinguish between what's real and what my mind is constructing. The smell is always present now, a constant companion. I see her more frequently, in reflections, in crowds, standing at the end of my hallway when I come home at night. Sometimes I wonder if she's trying to tell me something, if there's some message in her persistent presence. Other times I think she's simply reclaiming what was taken, the privacy of death, the sanctity of being left alone. We intruded into her final space, violated her solitude, and now she's doing the same to me. Or perhaps none of this is happening at all. Perhaps I'm sitting in a hospital somewhere, being treated for a psychotic break triggered by work-related trauma. Perhaps Oscar is in the next room, experiencing his own version of these hallucinations. Perhaps the smell is just a smell, a memory that refuses to fade, and the figure I keep seeing is nothing more than my guilt and exhaustion taking shape. I don't know anymore. That's the terrible truth of it. I can't distinguish between the reality of what happened and the reality my mind has constructed afterward. The job was real. I have the paperwork, the documentation, but the funeral, the figure on the street, the sense of being watched by someone who should be at rest. The smell is here now, even as I write this, stronger than ever, and I can feel her behind me standing in the doorway of my bedroom, waiting. I haven't turned to look. I'm afraid of what I'll see, or worse, afraid of what I won't see, of the empty doorway that will confirm my suspicion that I'm losing my grip on reality. In a moment, I'll turn around. I'll face whatever is or isn't there. I'll find out if she's real, or if I've become untethered from the world, drifting in some space where the dead and the living occupy the same uncertain territory. But for now, I sit here in the gray Stockholm morning, with that smell filling my lungs, and I wonder which would be worse, to find her standing there, or to find nothing at all. Story 13. The rope hadn't snapped his neck. That's what I remember most, what I can't stop remembering. When we found him in that abandoned warehouse off Route 9, 3 days after he'd walked away from his work release assignment at the county maintenance yard, he was still hanging there with his eyes open, but his neck wasn't broken. The coroner explained it to us later, said sometimes the drop isn't far enough, the angle isn't right, and instead of the quick death everyone imagines, it becomes something else entirely, something slower. The hyoid bone intact, the cervical vertebrae undisturbed. Just pressure and time and the body's slow surrender. We'd been searching since dawn, working a grid pattern through the industrial wasteland where the prison vans dropped off their crews. I was new then, only 6 months with the department, still eager to prove myself on every call. My captain, a weathered man named Henley, who'd seen 30 years of everything, led our unit through the skeletal remains of the old textile mill. The place had been gutted by fire a decade prior, leaving behind a maze of rusted machinery and scorched brick walls that the county never bothered to demolish. The smell hit us first. Even with the ventilation of broken windows and collapsed roof sections, death has a weight to it, a thickness in the air that makes you breathe through your mouth, even though you know that means you're tasting it. Henley raised his fist, signaling us to stop, and in that moment of silence I heard it, a faint creaking, like old ship timbers in a gentle swell, rhythmic, patient. We found him in what had been the loading bay. Someone had thrown a rope over an exposed I-beam 20 feet up, tied it off to a support column below. He'd kicked away the wooden crate he'd stood on, and there he hung, turning slightly in the draft that moved through the building like breath. The work-release jumpsuit was still clean, bright orange against the darkness. His hands weren't at his throat the way you'd expect. They hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if he'd simply decided to let go of everything. But his eyes, they were open and fixed on the entrance, right where we'd come in, and even though I knew about post-mortem changes, about the random directions a dead gaze could settle, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been watching that doorway, waiting for someone to arrive. The pupils were clouded with the white film of death, but beneath it, I swear I could still see the brown of the irises, and they seemed to track our movement as we spread out to secure the scene. Henley made me document everything while he called it in. I took photographs from every angle, my hand steady enough despite the way my stomach churned. I noted the rope, standard hardware store manila, quarter-inch thick, the kind anyone could buy. I noted the crate, stamped with the logo of a long-defunct manufacturing company. I noted the distance from the beam to the noose, the length of rope remaining, calculating in my head the drop that hadn't been enough. 4 feet, maybe 5, not the 8 or 10 you'd need for the merciful snap. The coroner confirmed my suspicion days later, over coffee at the station. The man, I never learned his name, couldn't bring myself to look at the report closely enough to read it, had strangled slowly. The positioning of the ligature marks suggested he'd struggled, body jerking in those final spasms. But the rope had held and the beam hadn't shifted, and eventually his brain had been starved of oxygen long enough that struggling became impossible. 30 seconds of consciousness, maybe more. Enough time to regret the choice, or to embrace it, or simply to experience the pure animal terror of suffocation. That should have been the end of it. Another tragedy in a career that would see dozens, eventually hundreds. I filed my report, attended the debriefing, accepted the department counselor's card, and promise of an open door if I needed to talk. I didn't need to talk. I was fine. The job was the job, and you either processed it or you found another line of work. Except I wasn't fine. The dream started about 2 weeks later. Always the same. I'd be back in that warehouse, but alone this time. No team behind me, no radio chatter, no protocols to follow. Just me and the vast empty space, and that rhythmic creaking drawing me forward. In the dream, I'd walk toward the loading bay with a flashlight that grew dimmer with each step, and when I finally reached the beam, there'd be nothing hanging there. Just the rope, swaying gently, empty noose drawing small circles in the dusty air. Then I'd feel breath on the back of my neck, warm, shallow, struggling breath, and I'd wake up with my heart hammering and my own breathing ragged, as if I'd been the one strangling. The dreams came every few nights at first, then weekly, then they'd disappear for months before returning with renewed intensity. I learned to manage them the way you learn to manage any recurring discomfort. I'd get up, drink water, remind myself of what was real. The man was dead. I'd done my job. The scene was processed, the body released to whatever family he had, the case closed. There was nothing more to it. 3 years passed. I made lieutenant. I moved to a better apartment on the north side, one with actual insulation and windows that closed properly. I started seeing someone from the dispatcher's office, a relationship that lasted 8 months before we both admitted we were better as colleagues than lovers. Life continued its steady, unremarkable progression, and the dreams became less frequent, fading into the background noise of a life spent running into burning buildings and pulling people from wrecked cars. Then I saw him at the grocery store. It was a Tuesday evening, that dead hour between dinner and closing when the aisles are mostly empty, and the fluorescent lights seem especially harsh. I was reaching for cereal, something mundane and automatic, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A man at the end of the aisle, wearing an orange work jumpsuit, watching me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I turned to look at him directly, but the aisle was empty, just boxes of pasta and canned goods and the hum of refrigeration units. I told myself I was tired. The shift had been long, a warehouse fire that had taken 8 hours to contain, and the smoke had gotten into my lungs despite the mask, leaving me with a headache that painkillers couldn't quite touch. I finished shopping and drove home, and it wasn't until I was unloading bags that I realized I hadn't bought cereal, had left the store with only half the items I'd needed, my mind too scattered to focus on something as simple as a shopping list. The second sighting came a week later, during my morning run. I followed the same route every day, 5 miles along the river trail, out to the old rail bridge and back. The path was popular with joggers and cyclists, crowded enough that you were never truly alone, but not so packed that you couldn't find your rhythm. I was at mile 3, in that meditative state where thought dissolves into pure physical movement, when I saw him standing on the bridge. He was leaning against the railing, looking down at the water 30 feet below, and he was wearing the same orange jumpsuit, the same posture, hands at his sides, fingers slightly curled. And even though I was 50 yards away and moving fast, even though the early morning light was still gray and uncertain, I recognized him. The shape of his shoulders, the angle of his head, the absolute stillness of someone who decided to let go of everything. I stopped running. My legs locked up and my breath caught, and for a moment I was back in that warehouse, smelling death and hearing that patient creaking. But I forced myself forward, forced my legs to move again, and as I got closer, the figure resolved into something else. A utility worker in a safety vest, the orange bright in the dawn light, leaning over to check something on the bridge's support structure. He glanced up as I passed, nodded a casual greeting, and returned to his work. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. I pushed through the remaining 2 miles at a pace that left my lungs burning and my legs shaking, and when I finally reached my apartment, I stood in the shower until the hot water ran cold, trying to wash away the feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The incidents multiplied, always at the edges of my vision, always that flash of orange that my brain interpreted as the jumpsuit before resolving into something innocent, a traffic cone, a construction sign, a child's discarded toy. I started avoiding certain places, certain routes, unconsciously reordering my life around the possibility of seeing him again. The grocery store became somewhere I went only during peak hours, when the crowd of people would make it impossible for anyone to stand and watch. The bridge became off limits, my running route shortened and diverted. But avoidance only works if the thing you're avoiding stays in one place. I was at the station, 6 months after the grocery store incident, when it happened. We'd just returned from a false alarm at a high school. Some kid had pulled the fire alarm as a prank, a waste of everyone's time that left us irritable and ready for the shift to end. I was in the equipment bay, checking my gear, when I heard it. That sound. That slow, patient creaking, like rope under strain, like weight turning in empty air. The bay was full of noise, other firefighters talking, the TV in the common room, the hiss and clank of the coffee maker. But underneath it all, threading through it like a melody only I could hear, was that rhythmic creak. I turned toward the sound, my hands gone cold despite the warmth of the bay, and I saw the storage loft above the engine bays. The space was rarely used, accessed by a ladder that most of us forgot was there, and in the shadows between the overhead lights, something was moving, swaying, turning slowly in a draft that didn't exist. I climbed the ladder before I could think better of it. My hands found the rungs automatically, muscle memory overriding the animal part of my brain that was screaming at me to get out, to leave, to run. The loft was dim and cluttered with old equipment, boxes of outdated gear, coils of retired hose, and hanging from one of the support beams, turning in that familiar slow circle, was a length of manila rope, 1/4 inch thick, the kind anyone could buy at any hardware store. The noose at the end was empty, but I could see the way the rope had been tied. The precise loops and knots, the careful measurement of length, 4 feet of drop, maybe 5. Not enough for the merciful snap, but enough for the slow pressure, the gradual surrender. I stood there for I don't know how long, watching it turn, listening to the creak of rope against wood. Then someone called my name from below, Henley, asking if I'd seen the logbook, and the spell broke. I looked down, answered something I don't remember, and when I looked back at the beam, the rope was gone. Just empty air and shadows and dust motes drifting in the light from below. Henley found me still standing there 5 minutes later. He climbed up, concern creasing his weathered face, asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, just checking to see if we'd stored some equipment up there. Couldn't remember what I'd been looking for. He accepted the lie the way good leaders do, but his eyes lingered on me as we descended, and I knew he was adding this to a mental file of concerns he'd eventually have to address. The rope appeared again 2 days later, in my apartment. I came home from a shift to find it coiled on my kitchen counter, neat and precise, like something a sailor would tie. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, my mind racing through possibilities. I'd locked the door. I always locked the door. There was no sign of forced entry, no displaced furniture, no missing items. Just the rope, sitting there like an invitation or a warning or a reminder of something I was supposed to understand. I called building maintenance, asked if they'd been in my unit for any reason. They checked their logs and told me no one had entered, suggested maybe I'd brought it home from work and forgotten about it. The explanation was absurd. Why would I bring a rope home? Why would I place it so carefully on the counter? But it was better than any alternative I could imagine, so I accepted it. I threw the rope away, double-bagged it, and took it directly to the dumpster, and tried to forget the way it had felt in my hands. The weight of it, the texture, the sense memory of that other rope, the one that had held a man's weight for however many minutes it took him to stop struggling. But throwing it away didn't help. The rope, or ropes like it, kept appearing. In my locker at work, in my car's trunk. Once, impossibly, in the shower when I pulled back the curtain, hanging from the shower head like a snake about to strike. Each time I disposed of it, and each time it returned, always with that same careful arrangement, that same silent insistence. I stopped sleeping. The dreams had evolved beyond the warehouse, now taking me to the bridge, to the grocery store, to my own apartment, and always ending the same way. That breath on my neck, that sense of someone standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. I'd wake up gasping, my hands at my own throat, checking for the pressure that wasn't there. Henley finally pulled me aside after I nearly drove the engine into a parked car, my attention fractured by exhaustion and the constant vigilance required to watch for orange jumpsuits in every crowd. He sent me home on mandatory leave, said I needed to see the department counselor, wouldn't take no for an answer this time. The concern in his voice was genuine, but underneath it I heard something else. The beginning of doubt about my fitness for duty, the start of a conversation that would end with me behind a desk or out of a job entirely. I went to the counselor. I sat in her comfortable office with its soft lighting and carefully neutral artwork, and I told her about the stress of the job, the accumulated weight of all the calls, the difficulty sleeping. I didn't tell her about the man in the orange jumpsuit, about the rope that kept appearing, about the way I could sometimes hear that creaking sound even in perfect silence. Some things you keep to yourself, not because you want to, but because saying them out loud makes them too real, gives them a power they didn't have while they stayed locked in your own head. She prescribed sleep medication and recommended I take up a hobby, something to occupy my mind during off hours. She was kind and professional, and completely useless. The medication helped me sleep, but the dreams just became more vivid, more detailed, and I'd wake up with the taste of dust in my mouth and rope burns on my palms, even though I hadn't touched anything. It's been 4 years since I found him in that warehouse. 4 years of sightings and appearances and that persistent feeling of being watched, being waited for, being slowly drawn towards something I don't want to understand. I've stopped trying to explain it away, stopped looking for rational reasons why I keep seeing a dead man's ghost, or hallucinating his presence, or whatever clinical term you want to apply to the dissolution of my grip on reality. Last night, I dreamed I was back at the warehouse again. The same dream I've had hundreds of times. walking through darkness toward that loading bay, flashlight dimming, creaking sound growing louder. But this time, when I reached the beam, the rope wasn't empty. This time, someone was hanging there, turning slowly in the draft, and it took me too long to recognize the orange firefighter's uniform, the hands hanging at the sides with fingers slightly curled, the eyes open and fixed on the entrance where I stood. I woke up in my car, parked outside the warehouse on Route 9. The building is scheduled for demolition next month. The county finally approved the budget, and it stood before me in the gray light of dawn, empty and waiting. My hands were on the steering wheel, but I don't remember driving here. I don't remember leaving my apartment or getting dressed or making the 20-minute journey across town. There's a 4-hour gap in my memory, a void between falling asleep in my bed and waking up here, and when I checked my phone, I had 3 missed calls from Henley and a text asking if I was okay, if I was planning to come in for my shift that started 2 hours ago. In the passenger seat beside me, coiled neat and precise, is a length of manila rope, 1/4 inch thick, the kind anyone can buy at any hardware store. And as I sit here, watching the warehouse in the growing light, I can hear it, that patient creaking, like rope under strain, like weight turning in empty air, like something that's been waiting for 4 years for me to understand the invitation. The demolition starts next month. 4 weeks, 28 days. I wonder if that's long enough, or if whatever's waiting in there has already decided the timeline doesn't matter anymore. I wonder if the rope in my passenger seat is meant for documentation, or if it's meant for something else entirely. I wonder if I'm losing my mind, or if my mind is the only thing I haven't lost yet. The sun is up now, fully illuminating the warehouse, and in one of the broken windows on the 2nd floor, I can see a figure standing, orange against the darkness, watching me watch it, waiting with the patience of someone who has nowhere else to be and nothing but time. I should start the car. I should drive away, call Henley, tell him I need more than leave, that I need help in ways the department counselor can't provide. I should throw away the rope and change my number and move to another city where abandoned warehouses and work release inmates and 4-foot drops are just stories I used to tell about someone else's life. But I don't start the car. I sit here with the rope in my passenger seat and the figure in the window, and I wait to see which one of us moves first, and whether the movement will be toward escape or toward finally understanding what the man with the open eyes has been trying to tell me all along. Whether the creaking I hear is memory or prophecy, and whether there's any meaningful difference between the two. The demolition starts in 4 weeks, but I don't think I have that long. I can feel it in my bones, in the rope burns that appear on my hands even when I haven't touched anything, in the way my breath catches sometimes for no reason, like my body is practicing for something it knows is coming. 4 weeks, or 4 days, or 4 hours. The timeline doesn't matter when the destination is already decided. I just hope when they find me, when Henley and the others come looking, following the GPS on my phone, or the trail of missed shifts and worried calls, they'll understand that some scenes never really close, that some cases stay open forever, waiting for that one piece of evidence that finally makes everything make sense. And I hope they'll see that whatever happens, whether it's in my head or hanging from a beam in an abandoned warehouse, it was always going to end this way. The figure in the window hasn't moved. Neither have I. The sun climbs higher, and the rope sits patient in my passenger seat. And somewhere in the distance I can hear sirens, maybe coming for me, maybe heading toward someone else's tragedy. And I wait to see which direction they're traveling, and whether direction even matters anymore when everywhere leads to the same place. Story 14. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar dirge overhead, but that Tuesday night their frequency felt different, just off enough to notice, just wrong enough to make the hair on my forearms stand at attention. I'd worked in the ICU for 11 years, and I'd learned to trust these small dissonances, these tremors in the ordinary fabric of the ward. They usually preceded something terrible. I was right. The code announcement crackled through the intercom at 2:47 a.m., and I remember checking the time because later, much later, I would count every minute that followed. Room 714. I grabbed the crash cart and ran, my sneakers squeaking against linoleum that had been waxed too many times, layered with decades of hurried footsteps and spilled urgency. The patient in 714 had been admitted 3 days prior, a man in his late 50s whose spine had gradually fused over 20 years from ankylosing spondylitis. His vertebrae had calcified into a single rigid column, transforming his skeleton into something more architectural than biological. The disease had bent him forward permanently, his neck locked at an angle that forced him to view the world from a perpetual bow, as if in constant apology. When I entered the room, Dr. Reeves was already positioning himself at the head of the bed. The patient's oxygen saturation had plummeted. Respiratory failure, they said. Standard procedure, intubation, secure the airway. Except nothing about this man's anatomy was standard, and somewhere in the chaos of the emergency, that essential detail seemed to slip through the cracks of protocol. I can still hear it. The sound wasn't loud. That's what people never understand when I try to explain it, and I've tried, mostly to the hospital psychiatrist they assigned me afterward. It wasn't a dramatic crack like a branch breaking, nothing cinematic or definitive. It was more like the sound of a green twig being bent too far, a muffled pop that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the architecture of him, followed by a sensation rather than a sound, a feeling of wrongness that transmitted itself through the air, through the floor, through my bones. Dr. Reeves had been trying to extend the patient's neck backward to visualize the airway. Textbook positioning, except the textbook assumed mobility. The fused cervical spine couldn't bend. It had forgotten how. When pressure met resistance, something had to give. The patient's eyes went wide. Not with pain exactly, though surely there was pain. What I saw in them was more fundamental. Recognition. The sudden, terrible understanding that something inside him had fundamentally broken, that he had become irrevocably more broken than he already was. Then those eyes went distant, unfocused, gazing at something beyond the ceiling tiles, beyond the hospital, beyond. We stabilized him, if you can call it that. His heart kept beating, his lungs continued to inflate and deflate with mechanical assistance, but something essential had severed. The neurologist would later explain that the spinal cord injury at C3-C4 had left him in a locked-in state, conscious but paralyzed from the neck down, unable to speak, unable to move anything except possibly his eyes, though even that remained uncertain. He could be fully aware in there, she said, trapped behind flesh that had become a prison, or he could be experiencing something else entirely. That was 6 weeks ago, and the man remains in room 714, sustained by machines, his status unchanged. But I haven't been unchanged. I haven't been the same since I heard that sound. It started small, as these things do. A sensation of being watched during my shifts, which is absurd in an ICU where we're always watching and being watched, where privacy dissolves under the fluorescent necessity of constant monitoring. But this felt different, a gaze with weight to it, with intention. I would feel it most strongly when passing room 714, even when I wasn't assigned to that wing, even when I deliberately took the long route to avoid it. The feeling followed me home. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and high ceilings that usually feel spacious, but lately seem to contain too much empty air, too many angles where shadows collect. I started noticing that certain spaces felt occupied, though nothing was there. The corner behind my reading chair, the gap between the refrigerator and the wall, the shower stall when I had my eyes closed, shampooing my hair, vulnerable and blind. Then came the dreams. Not nightmares exactly, nothing as straightforward as that. In them, I'm always in room 714, but the geometry is wrong. The ceiling is lower or higher than it should be. The walls meet at angles that don't conform to Euclidean space. The patient is in the bed, still bent at that terrible angle, but now his head swivels to track me. Impossible given his fused spine. Yet in the dream logic, this contradiction doesn't register as impossible, only as profoundly wrong. He doesn't speak. His mouth doesn't move. But I hear something anyway. A voice that seems to originate from the walls themselves, from the hum of the ventilator, from the drip of the IV. It tells me things in a language I don't know but somehow understand. Syllables that feel ancient and geometric, describing positions and angles that hurt to contemplate. When I wake, I have nosebleeds. Small ones at first, then more substantial, rusty rivulets that stain my pillowcase. I told myself it was stress, guilt perhaps. We're taught in nursing school about the psychological burden of medical errors, though this hadn't been my error, had it? I'd just been present, a witness. But the mind doesn't always make such fine distinctions. Trauma doesn't care about your job title or whether you were the one holding the laryngoscope. The hospital psychiatrist prescribed sleep medication. The pills sat untouched in my medicine cabinet. I didn't want to dull the edges of my awareness, not when something was watching, waiting, bending the angles of my perception. 3 weeks after the incident, I returned to room 714 for the first time since that night. I'd been avoiding it, trading assignments, manufacturing excuses. But eventually, inevitably, I found myself standing outside the door during my shift, drawn there by a compulsion I couldn't name. The room looked exactly as I remembered, the ventilator maintaining its rhythmic wheeze, the monitors displaying their steady parade of numbers, the patient in the bed, positioned now with careful attention to maintain spinal alignment. His eyes were open, staring at something above and to the left. They didn't move when I entered. The neurologist had said this was expected, that any eye movement was likely involuntary, meaningless, the random firing of damaged neural pathways. But I knew better. I felt the weight of his attention, the concentrated force of a consciousness trapped and raging behind that frozen facade. The air in the room felt thick, resistant, as if I were pushing through some invisible membrane with each breath. The temperature seemed wrong, not cold exactly, but lacking warmth in a way that went deeper than thermodynamics. I approached the bed, professional instinct overriding my unease. I needed to check his IV site, verify the ventilator settings, perform the routine assessments that nursing reduces to muscle memory. But as I reached for his wrist to check the pulse, unnecessary given the cardiac monitor, but habit demanded it, his eyes moved, not a random drift, a deliberate shift. His gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that felt physical, like pressure behind my sternum. And in that moment, I understood something that the neurology team hadn't found in their scans and assessments. He wasn't locked in. He was locked on. To me, to this place, to something. The ventilator alarm began to chirp. Nothing critical, just a minor pressure adjustment needed. But the sound seemed to trigger something. The lights flickered just once, so quickly I might have imagined it. The temperature dropped, and this time it was undeniable, my breath forming a small cloud in the suddenly arctic air. The shadows in the corners deepened, became more solid, took on suggestions of shape and mass. I stepped back from the bed, my professional composure cracking. The patient's eyes followed me, and I saw, or thought I saw, something behind them. Some intelligence that was both him and not him. Something that had perhaps taken up residence in the space that the injury had created, in the gaps between neurons that no longer fired correctly. The shadows moved. Not the way shadows move when light shifts, but with deliberate, purposeful motion. They stretched toward the bed, toward the patient, and I had the horrible impression of fingers, of hands, of geometries that shouldn't exist reaching out from impossible angles. And the patient's eyes, his eyes showed recognition, perhaps even relief. I ran. The hallway seemed longer than usual. The distance between room 714 and the nurse's station stretched and distorted. Behind me I could hear, or feel, the distinction had become blurred. Something keeping pace, matching my footsteps with a rhythm that was just slightly off, syncopated in a way that made my inner ear revolt. I reached the nurse's station, breathless, my heart hammering against my ribs. The charge nurse looked up from her paperwork, concerned, asking if I was all right. I wanted to tell her about the cold, the shadows, the eyes that tracked me with impossible focus. Instead, I said something about feeling unwell, asked to be relieved early. She agreed, worry evident in her expression. They'd all been watching me since the incident, I realized, waiting for me to break. Maybe I was breaking. That night, alone in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something home with me. Not something physical. This was subtler, more insidious. A displacement in the air, a wrongness in the angles where my walls met. I found myself compulsively checking the corners, turning on all the lights, unable to tolerate any space where shadows could gather. I pulled up medical journals on my laptop, searching for something, though I couldn't articulate what. Reports of locked-in syndrome, yes, those were plentiful, but what I was looking for lived in the spaces between the documented cases, in the footnotes and anomalies. I found references to patients who seemed to exert influence beyond their paralyzed bodies, whose rooms experienced unexplained phenomena, whose caregivers reported sensations of being watched, touched by invisible presences. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in evidence-based practice, in the material reality of bodies and their measurable functions, rejected this as nonsense, as pattern-seeking and random noise, as the desperate attempt of a guilty conscience to externalize its burden. But the older part of my mind, the animal brain that evolved to sense predators in the dark, knew better. I started researching the patient's history before his admission. This wasn't medical necessity but obsession, I knew that, yet I couldn't stop. I learned that he'd been a chiropractor before the disease made it impossible to continue working. There was a bitter irony in that. A man who'd spent his career manipulating spines betrayed by his own. I found his closed practice's old website, saw photos of him standing straight and proud, before the disease had bent him into perpetual supplication. There were comments on the old site, testimonials from former patients. Most were mundane praise, but a few struck me as strange. References to feeling different after his adjustments, to experiencing unusual dreams, to sensing new dimensions in familiar spaces. One person wrote that after a session, they'd become aware of angles they'd never noticed before, corners of rooms that seemed to extend further than they should. I closed the laptop, hands shaking. This was madness. I was constructing conspiracies from coincidence, building supernatural edifices on foundations of guilt and exhaustion. But that night, the dreams came again, more vivid than before. Room 714 expanded around me, its dimensions multiplying, walls sprouting new corners that folded into spaces that shouldn't exist within the hospital's architecture. The patient sat up. Impossible, but this was dream logic, his fused spine bending in ways that made my eyes water to witness. He turned toward me, and his neck moved in sections, pivoting at angles that nature had never intended, each vertebra rotating independently despite their fusion, creating a motion that was both mesmerizing and nauseating. He spoke, and this time I heard words, though they still felt wrong in my ears, as if they were forcing themselves into a language too limited to contain them. He told me about the space he'd discovered, the dimension that pain and paralysis had opened for him, the angles that existed between breaths, between heartbeats, between the electronic pulses of the monitors that sustained him. He said he'd been looking for this space his entire career, manipulating bodies, seeking the door. The injury hadn't trapped him, it had freed him. And I, by being present at the moment of his transformation, had been marked, tagged, made visible to things that existed in those between spaces. I woke with another nosebleed, more severe this time, and a certainty that felt like knowledge. The patient wasn't the one watching me. He was the door, and through him, something else was looking back. I haven't returned to work. I called in sick, citing psychological distress, which isn't entirely a lie. They've been understanding. There are protocols for healthcare workers experiencing trauma, and what happened in room 714 certainly qualified. They've given me leave, suggested therapy, offered resources. But how do you explain to a therapist that you've become aware of extra dimensions in your apartment? That the corners don't meet correctly anymore? That they extend into spaces that shouldn't exist within the building's blueprint? That sometimes, in your peripheral vision, you glimpse suggestions of movement in those impossible angles, geometries that hurt to contemplate directly? I've tried measuring the corners with a carpenter's square. They all read 90 degrees exactly, but measurement tools only capture 3 dimensions. And what I'm seeing, What's seeing me exists in the spaces between. The hospital calls periodically to check on me, to discuss my return to work timeline. During the last call, the HR representative mentioned casually that the patient in room 714 had been transferred to a long-term care facility. She said this as if it were good news, as if distance would matter. But I know better. The door doesn't close just because you move it to a different building. The angles don't correct themselves. And whatever began watching me that night when the neck snapped hasn't stopped. It's learning. I can feel it studying me through every corner of my apartment, through every shadow that falls at a slant, through every angle that doesn't quite add up. It's learning the geometry of me, mapping the architecture of my consciousness, finding the places where my own vertebrae meet, where my own spine bends. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the darkness is deepest, I can feel something pressing against the inside of my neck, testing the spaces between my bones, checking for fusion, for rigidity, for that perfect inflexibility that might, if bent wrong, if positioned incorrectly, break open another door. I should be terrified. Part of me is. But another part, a part that grows larger each day, is curious, eager, even, because I'm starting to understand what he discovered, what the injury revealed to him. There are spaces we're not meant to perceive, dimensions our evolution wisely blinded us to. But once you've seen them, once you've been marked by their attention, you can't unsee. The corners of my apartment are full of angles tonight, more than they should be, more than geometry allows. I've stopped trying to count them. I've stopped pretending they're not there. And I've started to wonder, when something finally bends me the wrong way, when my own vertebrae are pushed past their limit and something essential snaps, will I scream? Or will I finally see clearly what's been watching me all along, waiting patiently in the angles between angles, in the spaces where bones meet and break and open onto rooms that exist only in the mathematics of pain? I don't know yet, but I think I'm about to find out. The corners are getting closer.